Part 2, Christiana. Chapter 50, A Letter from the King. Christiana had always loved little Christian, and when the other young animals told her that he had run away from them across the plain and that they believed he had really gone to the celestial city, she was very sorry indeed. She had often heard about the city. Her own father and mother were both living there, and while they were travelling upon the way of the king, they had sent many loving messages to Christiana, desiring her to begin her pilgrimage and to bring her brothers and her little sister with her. But not long before little Christian went away, she was told that her father had crossed the dark river, and in a few days her mother followed him. Then Christiana received no more messages, and she felt sad and lonely. When little Christian talked to her about his book, she listened to him, but she did not believe what he said. "If my father and mother were really living in a beautiful city like that," she used to say, "I'm sure they would not forget us. They would have sent me another message. I think they were lost in the dark river, and we should never see them anymore." So when little Christian went away, she feared that he would be lost too, and she could not help crying to think of it. The summer and autumn passed, and the winter also. Then the spring came round again, and Christiana took her little sister Innocence into the fields to gather daisies. Innocence could run about now, and Christiana loved to see her playing happily among the flowers. "Last year," she thought, "Christian came with us into this very field the day before he went away, and we made daisy chains together. I wonder if he has found the celestial city, or whether he has been lost." She looked across the plain, and she could see the light in the distance shining brightly above the narrow gate. "Perhaps," she said to herself, "I will go some day, but I must wait until little Innocence is older, and I could not leave my brothers by themselves. I am sure they would not go with me now." Then she lifted Innocence in her arms and turned back toward the city of destruction. In the evening, when she had put little Innocence to bed, and the house was quite still, for the boys were playing in the market with their school friends, she sat down by the fire and thought of her father and mother, and of Christian also, and wished very much that she could see them all once more. That night she had a strange dream. She fancied she had really found the celestial city, and that she was walking along its streets with little Christian. Innocence was there too, and her 3 brothers, and they all went together into a beautiful palace where the king himself met them and spoke graciously to them. "I wish it had been true and not a dream," she thought when she woke. And as she could not go to sleep again, she got up, although it was very early, and began to put the house in order. Presently she heard a knock at the door and cried, "Come in!" She expected to see a neighbour, but when the door opened, one of the strangers entered. Her name was Wisdom, and she was the daughter of Evangelist. Christiana knew her, for she had seen her in the city, and sometimes watched her gathering the children round her that she might talk to them about the king. "I have been wishing to speak to you," she said, "but I have not been able to find you in the streets lately." "No," replied Christiana, "I was tired of the streets, and I took my little sister into the fields." Wisdom lay her wing gently on the girl's shoulder. "I don't think you are very happy, Christiana." "I am lonely," she answered. "You have your 3 brothers and Innocence." "Yes, but I am lonely," she repeated. "My father and mother are gone, and little Christian too, and I do not know what has become of them." "They are with the king in his glorious city." "Ah," said Christiana, "I have been told so often that the stories about the king and the celestial city are not true." "They are quite true," replied Wisdom. "The king is sorry that you do not believe me, and he has sent me to tell you that he wishes you to begin your pilgrimage at once, and to bring the boys and Innocence with you." "So many of us?" exclaimed Christiana. "Yes, the king's city is large and there is room in it for every pilgrim who comes to its gates. Do you not know how pleased your dear ones will be when they hear that those gates have been opened for you?" The tears came into Christiana's eyes and she wiped them away. "I will think about it," she said. "This will help you," answered Wisdom, and she drew out a folded piece of paper like that which Evangelist had given to Christian. "It is a letter from the king. Keep it safe and read it often. And when you reach the celestial city, you must show it to the shining ones who will meet you at the gate." Chapter 51. Christiana shows the letter to her brothers. Christiana could scarcely believe that the letter was really from the king, and for her. And when she had read it, her heart was filled with joy and sorrow together. Joy that the king should send her such a gracious message, and sorrow that she had not learned to love and obey him before. She looked up again at Wisdom, who was standing near her. "I will go," she said, "and I will try to take the children with me." Wisdom smiled at her. "That is right," she said. "Do not wait any longer. The way is easier for children than for older creatures, and the king will help you in all of your difficulties." "Can you not go with us?" said Christiana. "Then I should not be frightened." "No, I have other work to do, but you need not be frightened. You know the way to the narrow gate, and when you have passed through it, you will meet with many of the king's servants who will be very kind to you." Christiana read the king's letter many times over that day, and that evening she showed it to Matthew, her eldest brother. "What shall I do?" she asked him. "You will go, will you not?" "I should like to go, and would take Innocence, but what will become of the boys if I leave you alone?" "We must go too," said Matthew. "At any rate, I will." "Will you really? Oh, I'm so glad." "Well, I've often thought about it," continued Matthew, "since we knew that our father and mother had crossed the dark river. And when little Christian and Faithful went away, I was half inclined to follow them. It will be nice for now for us all to go together." Christiana smiled as she looked into the fire. "Mother would be so pleased to see us. But I do not know whether James and Joseph are willing. Perhaps they will be afraid of the long journey." Just at that moment, the door opened and the two younger boys ran in. "Oh," exclaimed James, "we are so tired. What are you talking about, you two?" "Christiana has had a letter," replied Matthew, and he laid the paper on the table where his brothers could read it as they stood side by side. "It's from the king," said Joseph. "Why, he has written to Christiana?" "Who brought it?" asked James. "Do you really think it came from the king?" "One of the strangers brought it. Her name is Wisdom. You have often seen her in the streets." "I know her. She spoke to me one day and I liked her. Shall you go?" Joseph came round to the fire and leaned against his sister's chair, looking into her face. "Will you come with me?" "I don't mind." "Shall we have to fight anyone? And will there be any wild beasts?" "I do not know, but Wisdom said we need not be frightened. The king will take care of us." "I should like to be a pilgrim," said James. "But Innocence is so tiny and you can't leave her behind." "No," said Matthew, "of course not. She can walk a little and we must carry her when she is tired." "When shall we go?" asked Joseph. "We have to pass through that gate with the lamp over it, don't we?" "Oh, don't you remember? Pliable went with little Christian last spring and they fell into the slough." "We will be careful," said Matthew. "When can you be ready, Christiana? Tomorrow or the next day?" "The next day, I think. We can prepare everything at night and then start very early as soon as the gates of the city are opened." Chapter 52. The children leave the city of destruction. In the afternoon of Christiana's last day in the city of destruction, 3 or 4 girls who had been her friends ran in to see her. "Oh, you do look busy," cried one. "We came to ask you to go with us into the country tomorrow." "I don't think I can," replied Christiana. "Why, are you putting everything away?" exclaimed another. "You must be getting ready for a journey." Christiana had not meant to say anything about the king's letter, but now she felt it would be better to tell her friends what she intended to do. "I have had a message from the king," she said, "and I am going to the celestial city." "Oh!" cried the girls. "How can you be so foolish?" "I am not foolish. I wish you would all come with me." "And leave our beautiful city and all our friends? What will your poor little sister do? And the boys? It's very wrong of you, Christiana, to think of leaving them." "They are going with me." Then the girls laughed. "You must be mad. How can a baby rabbit like Innocence be a pilgrim? Just think of all we have had heard about little Christian and his troubles. He was nearly lost in the slough to begin with, and you know when Distrust and Timorous came back, they told us that he had been met with 2 wolves on the hill of Difficulty." "Yes," said another, "and you cannot have forgotten the news we had from Vanity Fair about the death of Faithful. You are a silly girl to run into such danger, especially when you have a baby sister and 3 brothers to take care of." "Matthew is old enough now to help take care of the younger ones," replied Christiana, "and we are not afraid. The king has promised to watch over us. Here is his letter. You can read it if you like." But the girls did not believe in the king or care about his messages. "It is no use wasting our time," they said. "You must do as you please, but you will soon wish yourself back again." Christiana was not sorry when the door closed and she was once more alone. "I am glad wisdom came to me," she said to herself, "for I should have thought that just as they do if she had not spoken to me." Matthew did not stay long in the city that day, and even James and Joseph were eager to begin their pilgrimage and came home early so that they might help Christiana. "I have washed your clothes and mended them," she said, "but I never noticed before how shabby they were getting. You must keep them as tidy as you can, and perhaps the king will send us new ones." Very early in the morning, the children went quietly away from their cottage and passed out of the gate of the city. The keeper did not stop them, for he thought they were only going to spend a long day in the meadows. Christiana carried Innocence in her arms, and Matthew had brought a bag with some food. James and Joseph ran on before them, for they were anxious to reach the narrow gate. "Perhaps we may meet a wolf," said Joseph, "but I shall not be frightened." "Oh no," said James. "Pilgrims are always brave, and of course we must fight for our sisters." Innocence clapped her tiny hands when she saw the daisies nodding their pretty white heads in the grass, and Matthew began to gather a few of them for her to carry with her. While she was doing this, a young squirrel came into sight, running across the meadow from the city. "Stop!" she cried. "Please let me speak to Christiana." Christiana looked round. "It is Mercy," she said. Mercy was out of breath with running, but she caught Christiana's hand and held it fast. "I didn't care to go with the other girls," she said. "May I walk a little way with you?" "Oh yes," replied Christiana. "Why will you not go all the way?" "I have had no message," said Mercy, for she had come into the cottage with her school friends and had seen the king's letter. "That will not matter," said Matthew. "I am sure I have heard evangelists say that the king would like all the children to become pilgrims." But Mercy was timid, and she feared that the king might not receive her if she came to his city without being sent for. "I will tell you what to do," said Christiana. "Come with us as far as the narrow gate, and we will ask the king's servant whether you may pass through." Mercy was willing to do this, and as she was a gentle little squirrel and a favourite of the brothers, they were glad to have her with them. They all went on together happily until they reached the Slough of Despond. "This is where Pliable and Little Christian were nearly smothered," said Christiana. "I do not know how we shall cross, for it seems very dangerous indeed." The soft green mud was oozing between the tufts of grass, and as they looked carefully round, the children caught sight of the stepping stones. James and Joseph skipped lightly from stone to stone, but Matthew held Mercy's hand, for she was afraid of falling. And Innocence clasped her little arms tightly around Christiana's neck. Soon they found themselves once more on firm ground, and they knew that no other unsafe place lay between the city and the narrow gate. "We will walk quickly," said Christiana, "while the day is cool and pleasant, and perhaps we may be allowed to rest a little when we have entered the way of the King." Chapter 53. At the Narrow Gate. About the middle of the day, the 6 little pilgrims came up to the narrow gate. "You are the eldest," said Matthew to Christiana, "and the King's letter was for you, so you had better knock and tell the keeper why we have come." Christiana knocked at the gate several times, but no one answered. Then a dog began to bark very furiously indeed, and although James and Joseph had promised to be brave, they both turned pale and whispered to Mercy, "Shall we go back home?" "Oh no," said Mercy, but she felt frightened also. "We must knock again," said Matthew. So Christiana lifted the knocker and rapped once more as loudly as she could. Then Goodwill, who kept the gate, came out of his cottage and asked, "Who is there?" And when the dog heard his voice, it left off barking. "Please do not be vexed with us," said Christiana, "because we knocked so often. We thought you did not hear us, and we were frightened at the dog." Goodwill was not vexed. He looked kindly at the children and asked, "Where do you come from? And what do you wish me to do for you?" "We have come from the city where little Christian lived, and we are going to be the King's pilgrims, if you will let us pass through the gate. These are my brothers, and this is my little sister." Then Goodwill put his wing upon Christiana's shoulder and led her through the gateway, saying, "Let the little children come unto me, and forbid them not, for such is the kingdom of heaven." Christiana knew that these words had been spoken by the good prince himself. She had seen them written in the old book of which little Christian had been so fond, and she felt very happy as she entered the way of the King with Innocence in her arms and her brothers by her side. Poor little Mercy had not dared to follow her friends. She drew back when the gate was opened, and Goodwill did not see her. Then, as she heard the gate close and found herself alone, she began to cry, for she thought that perhaps Christiana would forget her. But Christiana had not forgotten her. "We have a young squirrel with us," she said to Goodwill, "who wishes to go to the celestial city. The King has not sent her a letter, so she is afraid." Christiana had not time to say anything more, for Mercy had grown frightened and was knocking upon the gate with all her might. "Who is that?" said Goodwill, and Christiana answered that it must be Mercy, of whom she had just been speaking. So Goodwill opened the gate again and looked out. Little Mercy was not strong, and the fear of being left behind had made her feel sick and faint. After knocking at the gate, she had fallen upon the grass and could not even look up when she heard the voice of Goodwill. The kind old owl stooped down and lifted the child into his wings. "Do not be frightened," he said, and then Mercy opened her eyes. "Tell me why you have come." "Oh," said Mercy, "I had no letter. It was only Christiana who asked me." "Did she wish you to go to the celestial city with her?" "Yes, and I should like to go. Will the king be angry, or will he let me become a pilgrim?" "The king's gate is open to everyone who knocks at it," said Goodwill. "Come in with me, little one, and do not cry or tremble any more." Then he led Mercy also through the gateway, and he gave her some sweet-scented herbs to smell so that she should not feel faint anymore. Chapter 54. The beginning of the pilgrimage. "You must rest in my cottage for a while," said Goodwill. He brought the children into a cool, quiet room, where he desired them to stay until he came for them. "Oh," exclaimed Christiana when they were left alone, "how glad I am that we are here." "I think I ought to be more glad than any of you," said Mercy. "I was so afraid," continued Christiana, "when we knocked and nobody answered. I thought perhaps we had had our long walk for nothing, especially when that dog barked so dreadfully." "The worst time was when you were all gone and I was left behind," said Mercy. "I didn't like to knock again until I looked up and saw the words carved over the gateway. Then I knocked as hard as I could." Christiana smiled. "You did knock," she said. "I thought you meant to force the gate open." "Well," said Mercy, "I couldn't help it. The gate was shut and that fierce dog must have been somewhere near. You would have knocked loudly if you had felt so frightened." "Was Goodwill angry? What did he say?" "He was smiling. I don't think he was angry. But I wonder why he keeps that dog. If I had known about it, I am not sure whether I should have dared to come. However, we are safe now, and I am very glad indeed." "So am I," said Mercy. "I think I will ask Goodwill why he allows such a savage dog to be near the gate." "Yes," said James. "Do ask him, Mercy. We are afraid it will bite us when we go away." So, when Goodwill returned, Mercy asked him why he kept the dog. "It is not mine," he answered. "There is a great castle not far from this gate which belongs to the wicked prince. The dog lives at the castle, but he can run along his master's ground until he comes close to my cottage. Then, when he hears the pilgrims knocking, he begins to bark. The wicked prince has taught him to do this, and once or twice he has broken through the fence and has bitten a pilgrim. But I always open the gate as quickly as possible, and you know the king's servants must not be frightened when danger is near to them." He laid the tip of his wing gently on Mercy's head, and the little girl looked up at him. "It was wrong of me," she said. "Another time I will remember and trust the king to take care of me." Then Christiana began to ask Goodwill about the way of the king, and he was ready to answer all of her questions. Afterward, he told the little pilgrims to wash themselves while he prepared a comfortable meal for them, so that they felt rested and refreshed and able to go on their journey. The garden of the wicked prince's castle lay close to the way of the king, but a high wall had been built by the king's servants along the roadside, so that the savage dog could not see the pilgrims or come near to hurt them after they had passed through the narrow gate. A number of trees were planted in the garden, and their boughs hung over the wall and made a pleasant shade. Christiana did not know that the garden belonged to the castle, and she allowed the children to walk near the wall. Presently they saw some of the trees were full of fruit. As the branches were quite within reach, Matthew began to gather the ripe apples. "You should not do that," said Christiana. "The fruit is not ours. Perhaps it is not wholesome." "It is very nice and sweet." "I would not eat it if I were you." James and Joseph were wise enough to listen to their sister, and they threw away the fruit that Matthew had picked for them. But Matthew felt vexed and said to himself, "I am nearly as old as Christiana, and I know quite as much as she does. The fruit is very good." So he went on eating it. Chapter 55. The First Trouble. The children were not far from the narrow gate when they saw two young cats coming toward them. They were much taller than Matthew. Their clothes were of bright-coloured velvet, and they wore caps with little plumes fastened at the side. "They must be princes," said little Joseph. "Has the king sent them to meet us?" "I don't think the king's servants are ever dressed so lavishly," replied Christiana, "and I am sure they cannot be princes from the celestial city, but their faces are bad and ugly. Let us walk quickly and take no notice of them." The cats were laughing and talking together, and when Christiana and the children came near to them, they stood in the middle of the path and would not allow the little pilgrims to pass by. Matthew and his brothers were frightened, and Christiana scarcely knew what to do. "We have no money to give you," she said. "We are quite poor, and we are going to the king's city." Then the tallest cat seized Christiana's hand, and his companion caught hold of Mercy. "Don't be frightened," they said. "We don't want your money, and we're not going to hurt you. You are two pretty little girls, and you shall stay and talk with us for a while." "We cannot," said Christiana. "We have no time to spare. Please let us go on." "Oh, that's all nonsense," replied the ugly cats. "We shall not let you waste a lovely day like this in travelling. You need not pretend you will not stay with us, because we shall make you." Perhaps if Matthew had not been eating the fruit from the wicked prince's garden, he would have felt braced and would at least have tried to defend his sisters and Mercy. But I am sorry to say he only stood trembling with fear, and when James and Joseph saw this, they were frightened also and clung closely to him. Christiana and Mercy saw that they were not able to get safely away from these two cats, so they both cried out for help. And as they were not far from the gate, Goodwill heard them and sent a servant at once to see what had happened. The servant quickly ran and soon overtook the children, and as he drew near, he called to the cat, saying, "What are you doing? How is it that you dare to hinder the king's pilgrims?" Then the cats heard the servant's voice, and they let Christiana and Mercy go free and hurried to the wall. They climbed it as fast as they could and dropped over into the wicked prince's garden. The children were glad to see them go, and Christiana began to thank the servant for his kindness in coming to help them. "You need not thank me," he said, "but it is not good for little girls to travel alone. I was surprised that you did not ask Goodwill to send a guide with you. Your brothers are not old enough to be of much use." Poor Matthew hung his head when he heard this and felt sadly ashamed of himself. He had intended to be so very brave, and he knew that he had acted like a coward. "We never thought about danger," said Christiana, "or that we should need a guide. I wish we had asked for one. Why did not Goodwill send someone with us if he knew that it was not safe for us to be alone?" "The king does not allow him to send guides unless the pilgrims wish for them," replied the servant. "Perhaps we had better turn back," said Christiana, "and tell Goodwill that we are sorry." "No, you must not turn back. I will take a message to him, and when you come to the house of the interpreter, you can ask for a guide there." "Oh," cried Mercy when the servant had left them, "I thought we should never have any trouble again." "You did not know," said Christiana, "but I did. I ought to have remembered that we may not be able to take care of ourselves as well as little Christian was." Chapter 56. The House of the Interpreter. After this trouble, the children went on their way steadily for some time. Matthew ate no more fruit, and James and Joseph held each other by the hand and kept nearer Christiana than they had done in the morning. Presently, Innocence began to grow sleepy, and Mercy said that her feet were aching badly, so that all the little pilgrims felt very much pleased when they saw a large house in the distance standing close to the wayside. "That must be the house of the interpreter," said Christiana. "We must ask if we may sleep there, and do not let us forget to beg for a guide." Now it happened that one of the king's servants who had seen the children leaving the city of destruction had passed by the house of the interpreter a little earlier in the day and had told his friends there of the new pilgrims who were on their way to the king's city. The interpreter's children remembered little Christian, and they knew that he had been sorry because Christiana would not come with him when he began his journey. "This must be the same Christiana," one of them said. "How pleased little Christian will be when he meets her at the gates of the city." The windows were wide open, and as the little pilgrims came up the pathway to the door of the house, they could hear the children talking, and Christiana fancied she caught the sound of her own name. She knocked timidly at the door, and a maidservant came to open it. "Who is it that you wish to see?" she asked. "We were told that this house belongs to one of the king's servants," replied Christiana, "and that he allows pilgrims to rest here. Do you think we may stay until the morning? For my little sister is tired, and we shall be afraid to go on travelling when it is dark." Then the maid answered, "You must tell me your name, and I will ask my master whether there is room for you in the house." "My name is Christiana. I knew little Christian, and I think he stayed here when he was a pilgrim. These are my 3 brothers, and this little girl is my friend." The maid turned away and went quickly to the room where the children were sitting. "Can you guess who is at the door?" she cried. "Christiana herself, with her brothers, her little sister, and her friend." The children were delighted and ran at once to find their father, that they might tell him the good news. The kind interpreter was pleased also, and he hastened to the door and welcomed the little pilgrims with many gentle words. "Are you really Christiana?" he asked, "of whom little Christian told us when he stayed here?" "Yes," she replied, "and I wish now that I had come with him, for I have found that all the things he told me were quite true." "You have done right to follow him," said the interpreter, "but we must not let you stand at the door. Come in, my children, and you shall rest." There were other pilgrims staying in the house, and 2 or 3 of the king's servants, as well as the interpreter's own family. When the kind old badger led Christiana into a large hall where they were sitting, everyone seemed pleased to see her. And although Innocence was a little shy at first, and Mercy was timid among so many strangers, they soon felt happy at home. Chapter 57. The Bear with the Straws. When the children had rested for a short time, the interpreter took them to see his beautiful picture of the Good Shepherd. Even baby Innocence understood how the little lamb had been lost upon the mountains and had been in sad trouble until the Good Shepherd had found it and taken it in his arms. After this, the old badger brought his little visitors into a dull, dark room, where a miserable-looking bear was working busily. The floor of the room was covered with straws and sticks, and the bear held a rake in his hand, with which he was collecting all the rubbish into a heap. He did not look up when the interpreter opened the door, and he seemed to care for nothing but his sticks and straws. "What is he collecting them for?" asked Matthew. "He thinks they are very precious," replied the interpreter. "He has been serving the wicked prince for a long time, and he believes that someday, in the midst of these useless straws, he will find a wonderful treasure. The king is sorry for him, and every day he sends a messenger to offer him a golden crown instead of straws." As the interpreter spoke, He pointed upward. And when the children raised their heads, they saw above them in the air a beautiful figure of an angel holding a bright crown in its hand. "But he doesn't see it," said Mercy. "No," said the interpreter, "he will not look up." Tears came into Christiana's eyes. "I am afraid I was just like him," she said. "I did not care about the king and his city, but I do care now." "Will he never look up?" asked James. Joseph added, "How long will the angel wait for him?" "I cannot tell you," replied the interpreter. "The king is very merciful and very patient, but the bear is so sure that he will find his treasure hidden in the rubbish that I do not know whether he will ever listen to the angel's voice." They went next into the garden, where the beds and borders were all filled with flowers. The interpreter told the children that the king's servants were like the flowers. Some plants are tall and stately, and no one can help seeing how beautiful they are. Others are quite tiny, and perhaps their blossoms are not even brightly coloured, and have only a sweet scent. Still, the gardener loves all his flowers and puts each one in its proper place. "In the same way," said the interpreter, "the king loves all his servants and gives them each a place in his kingdom. Some have difficult and important work to do, and others have only simple work. But not one little flower is forgotten." "Daisies are quite little flowers," said Mercy, "and so are violets, but they are very pretty." "Yes," said the interpreter, "and don't you think we love the violets as well as the roses? Children can be meek as daisies and as sweet as violets, and the king will see them and love them." It was now growing dark, for the sun had set, and presently the time came for supper. The interpreter kept the children near to him and talked kindly to them. He asked Christiana many questions about her old home, and even persuaded shy little Mercy to tell him how she had seen the king's letter to Christiana and had made up her mind to be a pilgrim. Chapter 58. Great Heart. In the morning, the little pilgrims were awakened by the light of the rising sun. They all got up quickly and dressed themselves, for they felt eager to continue their journey. But when they came downstairs, the interpreter called them to him and said, "These clothes that you are wearing will not do to travel in. We must give you some new ones out of the king's treasury." Christiana blushed. "I am so sorry," she said. "I washed and mended them as well as I could, but I know they are not nice." "You did your best," replied the interpreter kindly, "but even if they were quite new and clean, they would not be fit for you now. The king's pilgrims cannot wear garments that have been made in the cities of the wicked prince. Our good prince has provided white robes for all his children, and the king will not receive you in any others." When little Christian was travelling to the celestial city, you remember how the shining ones had met him at the cross and clothed him in white. Christiana, Mercy, the boys, and even little innocents now received garments that were just as spotless and beautiful as Christian's. And when they looked at each other, the children were almost frightened. If the journey was long and difficult, how could they possibly keep such robes clean until they reached the gates of the city? James and Joseph stood quite still, gazing at their snowy suits. "We can never play any more," they said. The interpreter smiled and drew the little boys nearer to him. "Do not be afraid," he said. "The king loves to see his children merry and happy. Your clothes will not be harmed unless you quarrel or play in a naughty way. You may run about as much as you like, if you do not leave the way of the king." Christiana and Mercy were looking at each other with tears in their eyes. "The king is very good," said Christiana. But Mercy could not speak. All this time she had been afraid because she had entered the narrow gate without receiving a message from the king. But now that she was clothed in garments from his own treasury, she felt that she was a true pilgrim, and she was ready to cry for joy. When they were all prepared to leave the house, the interpreter called one of his servants, whose name was Greatheart, and said to him, "You must go with these children to the Palace Beautiful, and take care that none of the king's enemies come near to hurt or frighten them on the way." Greatheart was tall and pleasant looking. He was a young badger, not much older than Christiana, but he wore a suit of bright armour, and he carried a sword at his side, so that the children felt sure he would be able to protect them if they met with any danger. Innocence stretched out her tiny arms when she saw his brave, kind face. He took the little girl from Christiana, saying, "Let me carry her a little way, and then she can run upon the grass until she is tired." The interpreter and his children came to the door and watched the little party set off. Greatheart carrying Innocence, while James and Joseph walked gravely in hand beside them. Then came Christiana and Mercy, and last of all Matthew, whose head was aching, though he did not choose to say anything about it. The fruit that he had eaten the day before was poisonous and had done him no good. But the foolish rabbit was ashamed to own how ill he felt, so he walked on behind Christiana and hoped that the Palace Beautiful was not far away. Chapter 59. Arrest by the Cross. Before the day became hot, the pilgrims came to the cross, and there Greatheart allowed them to rest. They all sat down upon the grass, and he told them how little Christian's burdens had fallen from his shoulders at this very place. Then Christiana began to question him about the good prince and all that he had done for his servants. Greatheart loved the good prince and was very willing to talk about him. So the minutes slipped quickly away, and the children felt almost sorry to leave their quiet resting place. Not very far from the cross, they saw a sad sight. Do you remember how little Christian tried to awaken the 3 foolish otters who were lying on the grass by the wayside, with their feet bound in iron fetters? You know that they would not listen to him, and he was obliged to leave them. After a time, they did awake, but they never tried to undo their fetters, for they had no wish to continue their journey. All day long they sat idly by the road, doing everything they could to hinder the king's pilgrims by talking to them and trying to persuade them to forsake the right path. At last, they did so much mischief that the king would have patience with them no longer, and their lives became forfeit. Their bodies remained in their chains, and pilgrims passing by saw them and took warning from their dreadful fate. Greatheart did not allow little Innocence to look at the bodies, because she was too young to understand how disobedient the 3 otters had been. But the other children saw them and asked what they had done. Greatheart told them the whole sad story, and Christiana said, "I am glad they did not turn little Christian out of the way." "So am I," said Mercy, "and I think it was a good thing they were punished. If not, and we'd been obliged to make our journey alone, they might have hurt or frightened us very much." The road now brought the children to the foot of the Hill of Difficulty, and there Greatheart showed them the 2 paths that the wicked prince had made, one leading into the woods and the other into the dark mountains. "Formalist and hypocrisy were lost there," said he, "at the time when little Christian climbed the hill. Since then, the king has sent servants to put posts and chains across the paths so that his pilgrims may know they are not safe. But many pilgrims are so foolish that they take no notice of the chains and try the paths because they look so easy, and then they are lost. Just at the foot of the hill and close to the way of the king, there was a little spring of pure water. Greatheart pointed it out to the children, who were thirsty after walking in the sun. The water flowed into a tiny pool, and when Christian had passed by this pool, it was as clear as crystal. But some of the wicked prince's servants, who were seeking for mischief to do, had found the spring, and they thought it would be a great thing to poison it and make it unfit for the king's pilgrims to drink from. So they trampled down the edges of the pool until the earth fell into the water and made it too muddy for anyone to drink. They did this whenever they passed that way. And when Greatheart brought his little band of pilgrims to the spring, he found it in a sad state. But Christiana had packed a little cup in the bag that the boys were carrying, and Greatheart told them to fill the cup with water and let it stand for a few moments. Then the sand and soil sank to the bottom, and the water was left clear and bright. So they all drank of it and were much refreshed. Chapter 60. The Hill of Difficulty. The path up the hillside was very hard to climb. Greatheart carried Innocence, and the children helped each other as much as they could. But the way was steep and rough, and the sun's rays were beating fiercely upon them as they toiled along. Presently Mercy exclaimed, "Oh, what a dreadful hill! I don't think I can walk another step. May we not sit down and rest a little?" When Joseph heard Mercy's words, he began to cry, for although he had been doing his best to climb the hill like a brave boy, he had fallen many times, and his hands and knees were bruised and sore. "If Mercy is tired," he thought, "it cannot be very babyish of me to be tired too." And then his weary little heart failed him, and the tears ran quickly down his cheeks to the ends of his whiskers. "We will not stay here," said Greatheart. "We are very near to the arbour that the king has provided as a resting place for his pilgrims. Is that Joseph crying? Come to me, little one, and hold my hand. You have climbed bravely, and you must not cry now that we have passed over the worst part of the way." Joseph felt happier when he heard Greatheart's words. He brushed away his tears, and clasping his little fingers tightly around those of his kind guide, he stepped out briskly. In a few minutes, the pleasant arbour came into sight, and the children hastened toward it. "Oh," cried Mercy, "it is good to rest when you are tired. Our king is kind to make such a cool, shady arbour for his pilgrims." "You see," said Greatheart, "our good prince has travelled over this path himself, so he knows how hard it is, and how much the pilgrims need a resting place." Then, calling James and Joseph to him, he asked them how they liked their pilgrimage. "I didn't like it at all just now," said Joseph, "but I am very much obliged to you for helping me." "I think," said James, "that I would rather be going uphill to the king's city than down again toward the wicked prince's country." "Yes," said Greatheart, "and when you reach the king's city, you will be so happy that you will forget all the trouble you've had on your journey." "Would you not like something to eat while you are resting?" said Christiana. "The interpreter gave me some dried fruit and a piece of honeycomb." She brought out the little store and divided it among them, asking Greatheart to take his share. But the lad refused, saying he would soon be at home again, where plenty of food would be prepared for him, and they were pilgrims and must make the most of what was provided for them. Chapter 61. The King's Arbour. The little pilgrims sat quietly in the king's arbour, eating their fruit and talking happily together, while Greatheart stood in the doorway watching them. "We must not rest too long," he said presently, "for we have still some distance to go, and the sun will soon be setting." James and Joseph sprang up at once and started off hand in hand. All their bravery had come back again, and they whispered to each other that they would not mind very much, even if they were alone. "Greatheart says the king is so good, and we know he took care of little Christian," said Joseph. "Yes," said James, "and if we love him, he will not let anyone hurt us. So I think we had better not feel frightened anymore." When Christiana saw her two little brothers set off so quickly, she made haste to follow them. The kind interpreter had given her a bottle filled with refreshing drink, and she had not gone very far before she found that she had left this bottle in the king's arbour. James ran back to look for it, and while they were waiting for him, Mercy said, "Did not Christian lose his roll here? This seems to be a forgetting place." Greatheart smiled, and Christiana asked why Pilgrims lost things in that arbour. "I remember," she said, "that I have heard of other pilgrims who have had to turn back here to look for something they had left behind." "It is only because they are careless," replied Greatheart. "They are tired of climbing the hill, and the rest in the arbour makes them feel comfortable and happy. Very often they are tempted to sit here longer than they ought to do, and they fall asleep, as little Christian did. They start up in such a hurry that they are almost sure to lose something without noticing it." James soon returned with the bottle in his hand, and the little pilgrims climbed steadily up the hill until they reached the place where Mistrust and Timorous met Christian and frightened him by telling him of the wolves. The two foolish skunks were afterward caught and punished by the king's servants, and a stone was placed by the wayside with some words written upon it advising pilgrims not to listen to animals who tried to persuade them that the way of the king was too difficult or dangerous for them. "But there are some wolves, are there not?" asked Joseph. "Yes," replied Greatheart, "but you need not be afraid of them." Joseph looked at his brother, and the two little fellows clasped each other's hands more tightly. "I don't know whether I should quite like to meet a wolf," whispered James. "It might be a very savage one. We will try not to mind, but we had better keep close to Greatheart." The sun had now set, and the shadows were deepening every moment. The wolves were wide awake when the children came in sight, and they both stood up and growled loudly. Poor little James and Joseph shook with fear, and they slipped behind Greatheart, who had drawn his sword and held it in his hand, ready to strike the wolves if they sprang forward. The great beasts were chained, but the path between them was very narrow, and the savage creatures sometimes tried to seize the pilgrims who wished to pass by them. Chapter 62. Giant Grim and the Wolves. Greatheart soon missed the two little boys and looked around to see what had become of them. "This is not right," he said. "You were running bravely before us when there was no danger, and now you're hiding for fear of the wolves. You must learn to trust in the king, and then you will not be so much afraid." But all the children were frightened, and even Christiana felt glad Greatheart was with them. He looked so strong and brave. "I don't know what we should have done," said Mercy, "if we had no guide to go before us. Oh, do you see?" she added. "There is a terrible giant standing by the wolves." The giant warthog's name was Grim, and he had made a home for himself near the way of the king. He had taught the wolves to obey him, and often he came to feed them and to frighten any pilgrims who might be passing by. When he saw Greatheart, he stepped into the narrow path and stood with his hands upon the necks of the two wolves. Greatheart went boldly forward, but the children clung to each other and waited to see what would happen. "What business have you to walk upon this path?" said the giant. Greatheart answered, "I am taking these children home to the celestial city." "This is not the way to the city," said Grim. "I shall not let you pass. My wolves are very fierce, and I can make them tear you to pieces." As Christiana looked before her, she saw that the path was all grown over with grass. The giant had frightened the king's pilgrims so much that for many weeks scarcely anyone had dared to pass that way. They had forgotten that the king would take care of them. But Christiana remembered what wisdom had told her before she left home, and she suddenly cried out, "We are only children, but we are not afraid. Our God will take care of us and will bring us safely past the wolves." When the giant heard Christiana's voice, he saw that it was a little rabbit who was speaking. He laughed and said that she should not go another step toward the king's city, for he and his wolves could kill her and her companions. Christiana clasped little Innocence very closely in her arms, and Mercy clung to her, scarcely daring to look up. The boys were all crying together, even Matthew, who had never felt brave or happy since he had eaten the fruit from the wicked prince's garden. But Greatheart kept on his way, and the children crept timidly after him. His armour shone brightly before them in the midst of the shadow before daylight was nearly gone. And in a moment his sword flashed through the air and the giant moved back a few paces. "Do you think you can kill me?" Grim shouted. "This path belongs to the king," said Greatheart. "Stand and defend yourself, for if you will not let the children pass, I will fight for them." Chapter 63. Watchful receives the children. When Greatheart raised his sword to strike the second time, the giant swooped down to unfasten the chains of the wolves. But before he could do this, the sharp weapon crashed through his helmet and he fell to his knees. He tried to get up again, but the king helped his brave young soldier, and after a short struggle, the terrible giant lay dead at Greatheart's feet. Then the lad turned around to look for the little pilgrims. Mercy had hidden her face, but Christiana had watched the battle. When the giant shrieked with pain, she could not help trembling. Greatheart held out his hand to her. "Come," he said. "There is no danger now. Keep close to me, and the wolves will not hurt you. Their master is dead, and they are too much frightened to spring at anyone." The children saw the wolves were cowering upon the ground, so they hurried past them and followed Greatheart to the gate of the Palace Beautiful. Watchful, the doorkeeper, looked out of this window and asked who was there. "It is I," said Greatheart. Watchful knew his voice, and taking his lantern, he came quickly to the gate and opened it. "How is it that you are so late?" said he. "I have brought some little pilgrims from the house of the interpreter," answered Greatheart. "We would have been here earlier, but the giant met us and wished to turn us back again. I had to fight with him, but the king helped us, and I have killed him." "I am glad that he is dead," said Watchful, "but he has given us much trouble. You must come in and rest yourself." "No," replied Greatheart. "It is late, and my master will expect me to return tonight." "Oh," exclaimed Christiana, "how can we ever reach the celestial city unless you go with us?" "Yes, indeed," cried Mercy. "There are so many dangers, and we have no strength to fight with giants and wild beasts." Matthew and Joseph were afraid to speak, but little James came close to Greatheart's side and clasped his hand, saying, "Do please go all the way with us." "I will go with you very gladly," said Greatheart, "but I first must ask leave of my master. You should have spoken to him this morning when we were setting out. I must go back tonight, but I will tell him what you say, and perhaps he will let me come back to you again." So he bade them all good night and was soon out of sight, for it was not quite dark. Then Watchful turned to Christiana and asked her who she was and where she had been living. Christiana told him, and he was pleased to hear that she was Christian's friend. Everyone in the palace liked the little boy, and they had not forgotten how lovingly he spoke of Christiana. Watchful rang his bell, and the maidservant answered it and went quickly back into the palace with his message. Soon Prudence and her sisters came out to welcome their guests. Discretion had gone away to work for the king in another place, but her 3 daughters had the care of the palace, and they received Christiana very kindly. Chapter 64. Mercy's Dream. "Supper is ready," said Prudence, as she led the children through the large hall. "So we will not tire you with talking tonight. You must sleep well, and tomorrow we shall like to hear all about your journey." She looked so kind and she spoke so gently that Christiana took courage and said, "I don't know if I ought to ask for anything, but if you would let us sleep in the room where little Christian slept, we should be so glad." Prudence answered that no one was using the room and she would be pleased to let them have it. And there was also another little room opening onto it, which she said she would give to the boys. Christiana and Mercy lay awake for a long time, talking of all that had happened since they left the City of Destruction. "I didn't think," said Christiana, "when little Christian used to tell me about the king, that I should ever become a pilgrim myself." "No," said Mercy, "and you never thought you would come to stay at this grand palace and sleep in the very room that Christian slept in." "I loved him so much," continued Christiana. "He was just like one of my own brothers, and I felt so sorry when they told me that he had really gone away. But now I am happy again, for I know that he is with the king, and someday I shall meet him in the beautiful celestial city." "Listen," cried Mercy. "Is not that the sound of music?" "I am sure it is, and singing too. Did you ever hear anything so sweet?" The children lay still, while below in the hall of the palace the king's servants sang his praises before they went to rest. Little Innocence fell asleep in her sister's arms, and when the music ceased, Christiana and Mercy whispered "good night" to each other and closed their eyes, feeling happier than they had ever felt before. In the morning, Christiana said, "Did you know you were laughing in your sleep? Did you have a dream?" Mercy's eyes shone as she answered, "I had a lovely dream." "Did I really laugh?" "Yes, you awakened me. What was your dream about?" "I thought I was sitting in a lonely place and crying because I felt miserable. A number of children came and teased me and wanted to know what I was crying for. Some of them laughed at me and pushed me so that I cried more than ever. At last I looked up and I saw a beautiful angel with soft white wings. He came straight to me and said, 'Mercy, what are you crying for?' I told him that I was miserable. Then he spoke gently and wiped the tears from my face, and he gave me a dress all shining with silver and gold. He put a crown upon my head and took me by the hand, and we went on and on together until we came to a great gold gate. The angel knocked and the gate was opened, and he took me in and brought me to a throne where the king was sitting. Oh, Christiana! He looked so kind and gracious. I didn't feel the least bit afraid. And he held out his hand to me, saying, "Welcome, little daughter." Everything was bright and twinkling, just like the stars in the night, and I thought I saw little Christian. And then I awoke. Are you sure I laughed? Yes, and I don't wonder when you had such a nice dream. I think it must be time for us to get up now, and we'd better awaken the boys. Chapter 65. Pleasant Days. Little Christian stayed here more than one night, said Mercy, while they were dressing. If Prudence invites us, what shall you say? She looks so pleasant. I should like to make friends with her and her sisters. We will see what they wish us to do, replied Christiana. Perhaps all the Pilgrims stay here for a few days. After breakfast, the three sisters began to talk to their new guests, and presently Prudence said, "We should like you to stay with us for a little while, if you think you can be happy here." "Oh yes," answered Christiana. "We shall enjoy it very much indeed." The Little Pilgrims spent a whole month at the Palace Beautiful, and during that time many things happened of which I must tell you. Prudence and her sisters were very kind, and sometimes Prudence called the three boys together and questioned them to see what they knew. Christiana had tried to teach them about the king and his son, and she was pleased to hear that they answered well. "You must take pains to remember what your sister teaches you," said Prudence. "And when you hear older animals talking of holy things, it will be right for you to listen, that you may learn more about the king and his goodness. And do not forget that the flowers and the birds and all the beautiful things around you were made by the king, and that there is a lesson for you to learn from even the humblest daisy or the tiniest fly. You are all so fond of reading," she continued, "and that is a good thing, but you may be sure that you will never find any better book than the king's own book, the one that little Christian loved so dearly. There are stories in it for little children and wise sayings for old folks, and the more you read it, the more you will love it, for it will teach you how to serve the king faithfully." Not far from the palace lived a squirrel whose name was Brisk. He was a bright, good-natured lad, and Prudence hoped that he would one day be a true servant of the king. He often came to the palace and talked to her, but she had never yet been able to persuade him to give up his careless ways and become a pilgrim. He always said he was too busy, but that someday he would find time to begin his journey. When the Little Pilgrims had been at the palace for about a week, Brisk came in one morning as usual. Mercy had a very sweet little face, and when Brisk began to talk to her, he thought she was the nicest little girl he had ever seen. He asked her to come with him to see his brothers and sisters, but Mercy answered that she had a great deal of work to do, for she did not think that Prudence would be pleased if she left the palace. Brisk was so busy himself that he did not like Mercy any the less for being industrious, and he came to the palace nearly every day that he might talk to her. Mercy asked her friends about him, and they told her that he had not yet learned to love the king, although he liked to come to the palace and talk with the Pilgrims. "He is a nice squirrel," said Mercy, "but he will not be a good friend for me if he does not love the king." So whenever he came, she sat quietly sewing and did not take much notice of him. Chapter 66. Matthew's Illness. Brisk was vexed when he found that Mercy did not care to talk with him, and one day he said to her, "You are always sewing." Mercy looked up smiling. "Yes," she said, "if I have no work for myself, there's always plenty to do for others." "You must earn a lot of money," said Brisk. "I don't do it for money," replied Mercy. "What do you do it for then?" "I am making some clothes for charity. She gives them away to animals who are very poor." "Oh," said Brisk, and he looked so surprised that Mercy could not help smiling. He did not come again to the palace until the little Pilgrims had gone, and when Prudence asked him why he had forsaken his friend, he replied that Mercy was very pretty, but she had such foolish ways. However, Mercy was not sorry that he did not come. "I could not work so well when he was talking to me," she said, "and I don't wish for any friends who do not serve the king." "That is right," said Prudence, stroking Mercy's soft fur. "You cannot help meeting boys and girls who are careless like Brisk, but it is wise not to have too much to do with them." Christiana was now in great trouble. Matthew had been feeling ill all of this time, and each day when he got up, his head seemed to ache more, and he often felt so sick and faint that he could scarcely stand. At last, he was obliged to tell his sister, and Christiana wondered what could have made him ill, for she had forgotten all about the fruit that he had eaten. The next morning he could not lift his head from his pillow when Christiana came to awaken him, and she made haste to finish dressing so that she might ask Prudence what she must do. Prudence sent at once for the doctor, a serious opossum named Skill. He was not long in coming, and Christiana took him up to see the sick boy. Matthew lay in bed, and Joseph sat near to him, for the brothers were very fond of each other. "What has he been eating?" asked Skill. "Nothing but wholesome food," said Christiana. Skill shook his head. "He has been eating poison, and if the medicine I can give him will not take effect, he will die." Poor Christiana was so troubled that she could not speak. But Joseph exclaimed, "Oh, don't you remember the fruit? It hung over the wall by the narrow gate, and Matthew would eat it, but you made us throw it away." "Yes, he did," replied Christiana. "I told him not to take it, but I remember he would not listen to me." "Ah," said the doctor, "I was sure he had eaten something poisonous, and that fruit is worse than any other, for it grows in the wicked prince's own garden." The tears ran down Christiana's cheeks, for Matthew lay upon the bed, looking so pale and still that she feared the doctor's words would come true, and that he would really die. When Skill saw how frightened Christiana was, he spoke to her gently. "Do not be too unhappy. I have one of the king's medicines with me, and if he has not eaten a great quantity of fruit, it may do him good." Chapter 67. The Golden Anchor. The medicine that Skill prepared was very bitter, and Matthew was too ill to care what anyone said to him. For a long time, neither the doctor nor Christiana could persuade him to take it. But at last, after a great deal of trouble, he was made to drink it. Although for many hours he was in terrible pain, toward evening he began to grow better, and Christiana was thankful to see him fall into a quiet sleep. The next day he was able to get up for a while, but his illness had made him so weak that he could not walk without help from a staff. Everyone was very kind to him, and Christiana's heart was full of thankfulness to the king for sparing his life. "I should like to have some of that medicine always with me," she said. Skill was very willing to prepare some for her and told her how and when it shall be used. It was perhaps a good thing for Matthew that he had suffered so much, for he was now more ready to listen to his sister's advice. And instead of thinking he was too old to be taught by Prudence, he came to her as James and Joseph did, and asked her about many things that he did not understand. The time passed pleasantly away, and toward the end of the month, Joseph reminded Christiana that she had wished Greatheart to guide them to the celestial city. "He was so good to us, and he is so brave," said the little rabbit. "How can we find out if the interpreter will let him come?" "I think I must write to him," said Christiana. So she wrote a letter that day and gave it to Watchful, who sent a messenger with it to the house of the interpreter. In the evening, the messenger returned, saying that the interpreter had read the letter and that he would send Greatheart to guide the little pilgrims on their journey. Prudence and her sisters were sorry to part with the children, and as those last days were passing, they took care to show them all the treasures for which the Palace Beautiful was so famous. Among other things, Christiana saw and admired the little golden anchor. "You shall have it for yourself if you like," said Piety. "You can wear it always, and when you look at it, do not forget what it means. You know what is the use of an anchor. If it is firmly fixed, the sailors do not mind how rough the sea may be. The anchor holds their vessel safely, though the waves may be tossing and the wind roaring all around them. So, if you love the king, the hope that he will help you will keep your heart from failing. And though you may be in the greatest danger or difficulty, you will never be really afraid." The anchor hung upon a slender chain, and Christiana clasped it around her neck, saying, "I shall be so glad to have it, for it will help us all to remember what you have taught us." While they were talking, a knock was heard at the gate, and soon Watchful rang his bell and sent word that Greatheart had arrived. How pleased the children were to see him. Innocence ran at once into his arms, and as he lifted her up, James and Joseph clung to him on either side. "I have brought a gift for you from my master," he said, when the little ones had released him and he was able to speak to Christiana. He showed her a large store of dried fruit. "It can be easily carried, and you will find it useful when we are at a distance from any houses." Chapter 68. The Valley of Humiliation. Christiana was much pleased at the interpreter's kindness, and she had to thank Prudence for making their stay at the Palace Beautiful so pleasant. It was early when Greatheart arrived, and the children were not long in preparing for their journey. "We will go to the bottom of the hill with you," said Prudence. "The path is slippery and rather dangerous." As they passed through the great gate, Christiana said goodbye to Watchful and asked him whether any other pilgrims had gone by that day. Watchful said no, but a traveller had rested in his lodge the night before and had told him of some pilgrims who had been attacked and robbed by the wicked prince's servants. "But you need not be troubled," he said, "for the king's soldiers heard of it and they pursued the robbers, and they are now in prison." Christiana and Mercy had turned pale when Watchful mentioned the robbers, but Matthew touched his sister's hand, whispering, "You need not be afraid, Christiana. You are forgetting that we have Greatheart with us." So the little party set out and began to descend the steep path that had led into the Valley of Humiliation. It was slippery, but Piety carried Innocence, and Prudence gave a hand to each of the little brothers, while Greatheart went first with Christiana, and Matthew came behind them all with Mercy. At last they reached the valley in safety, and Piety said, "It was in this valley that Christian fought his battle with self. But if that bad wild dog comes out to meet you, you must not be frightened. Greatheart will take good care of you, and the king will be ready to help you." Then the sisters returned to the palace, and the children followed their guide across the valley. It was a lovely spot, and just at this time the ground was covered with lilies, which filled the air with their sweet scent. "I should not have thought that the wicked prince or his servants would ever come here," said Christiana. "It is so peaceful." "It is our good prince's favourite valley," replied Greatheart. "He once lived here for some time. But you must not expect to find any place where the wicked prince and his servants do not come until you are in the king's own country." Presently, Innocence began to clap her hands with delight, for at a little distance from the pathway she saw a number of sheep feeding, with lambs frisking happily beside their mothers. A young shepherd was taking care of them, but he was among the trees where he could not see the pilgrims, although they could see him. He was singing a merry little song. "He is poor," said Greatheart, "yet he is happy. He works faithfully and knows that his master is pleased with him." Chapter 69. The Dark Valley. "Where did Self meet Christian?" asked James. "Shall we see the very place?" "We shall come to it presently," replied Greatheart. "Self often meets pilgrims in that part of the valley. It is called Forgetful Green." "Why?" asked Mercy. "Because when pilgrims have stayed at the Palace Beautiful and are walking along this pleasant path, they often forget the way of the king is not all smooth and easy, and they begin to think that all dangers are past." "Did Christian forget?" "I think he did, but you know he loved the king dearly, and he would not let Self persuade him to give up his journey." It was not long before they reached the place where the battle was fought, and Greatheart told the story over again, for the boys loved to hear of little Christian's bravery, and how wonderfully the king had helped him to overcome his enemy. Greatheart also showed them the rock by which the little wounded soldier had rested after the battle, and he told them of the beautiful dream that had comforted him so much. The little pilgrims were now drawing near to the entrance of the dark valley. You remember Christian had to pass through that terrible place in the night. It was now early in the afternoon, and Greatheart hoped that he would be able to guide the children safely over the worst part before the darkness fell upon them. It was always gloomy in the dark valley, for the rocks were high and leaned toward each other, so that the sun could never shine upon the path below. Greatheart looked at the children as they drew closer to him. Mercy held Christiana's hand, and her lips were trembling. But Christiana pointed to the anchor that she wore upon her breast, and though their faces were pale, Greatheart knew that they were both thinking of the king, and that they would follow him bravely through the terrors of the valley. James and Joseph were in great fear. The strange noises among the rocks and the dimness of the lights frightened them more than the sight of the narrow, dangerous pathway. But Matthew made them walk before him and did his best to cheer and encourage them. "Follow me carefully," said Greatheart, "and do not tremble, or you will miss your footing. Remember that the shining ones are near, though you cannot see them, and if you trust in the king, the wicked prince and his servants cannot harm you." But poor little James had not gone very far before his feet suddenly slipped, and he would have fallen if Matthew had not caught him in his arms. Greatheart stepped back, stooped down, and lifted the rabbit onto his knee. Christiana looked anxiously into his face, for she feared that someone had hurt him. "He is only faint," said Greatheart. "If you will give him a little of Skill's medicine, he will soon revive." The medicine was not nice, but Christiana persuaded her brother to take it, and presently he opened his eyes and began to feel better. "I was frightened," he said. "I thought I saw horrible things. Will the king be angry?" "No," replied Greatheart. "He knows how terrible this valley is, and that you are only a little boy." Chapter 70. Terrors of the Way. The dark valley was indeed a terrible place, and even Christiana grew timid and fancied that she could see strange shapes among the shadows. But Greatheart went steadily forward, and the little pilgrims followed him closely until they had passed halfway through the valley. Then Mercy, looking behind her, saw a wolf coming after them. It began to snarl as it drew near, and Greatheart made the children go behind him while he waited for the savage beast. But when the creature saw that its enemy was prepared to fight instead of running away, it crouched down upon the path and came no further. Soon after this, Greatheart himself was obliged to stop, for he found that the narrow path had been broken away, and a deep pit lay just before him. He did not know how to take the little pilgrims over it, for although a tall, active lad like Matthew might have been able to cross it, the girls and the little boys could not possibly have done so. And in a moment, while he was considering what to do, a thick mist rose up around them, so they could not even see each other. "This is dreadful," cried Christiana. "What can we do?" "We can only pray to the king," answered Greatheart. "He will not forsake us. Perhaps the pit is not a real one. The wicked prince has power in this valley to make us think that we can see dangers that are not really there. We must stand quite still until the mist clears away." The children obeyed, keeping hold of each other's hands and praying in their hearts to the king to deliver them. "It must have been worse for poor little Christian than it is for us," said Christiana presently. "He was alone, and he came through the valley in the night." "The king was watching over him," said Greatheart. "I have brought many pilgrims along this pathway, and sometimes the dangers have been far greater than it is now. But the king has always helped us, and we have been brought out safely." Greatheart's words comforted the little pilgrims, and they waited patiently, although the strange noises and the sound of footsteps hurrying up and down were very terrifying in the darkness. But no one came near to hurt them, and after a time a light began to break through the mist. Soon it was clear enough to see the ground. "It is as I thought," said Greatheart. "The pit was not real. See, the pathway is quite firm." How thankful the children were, and how gladly they went on their way. But a new trouble soon came upon them. For some distance, the valley was filled with a poisonous vapor, so that the air was scarcely fit to breathe. "This is not a nice part of our pilgrimage," Mercy sighed. "I do not like it so well as staying at the narrow gate, or with the interpreter at the Palace Beautiful." "Ah," said Matthew, "but think how much worse it would be to live here always, as we might have to do if we served the wicked prince. Perhaps the king wishes us to pass through this dreadful place so that we may learn to care more about being with him in the celestial city." "That is just the reason," said Greatheart. "Shall we soon be able to see the end of the valley?" asked Joseph, for he was beginning to feel tired and giddy with walking upon the narrow path. "We are almost there," answered Greatheart, "but now you must be very careful, for we are coming to the snares." Chapter 71. The End of the Valley. I told you how little Christian was troubled by finding the ground near the end of the dark valley covered with snares placed cunningly up and down to entrap the pilgrims. Greatheart led his company slowly along, but they found it difficult to walk upon this dangerous path without falling or getting their feet entangled. Presently they saw the body of an animal lying dead along the wayside. "His name was Heedless," said Greatheart, and he fancied he could walk safely here without the help of the king. But as he hurried carelessly along, his feet were caught in a snare that threw him down, and his companion, who was called Take Heed, could not unfasten it. "Did Take Heed escape?" asked Mercy. Yes, but it made him very sad to leave his friend in the power of the wicked prince. You remember that just at the end of the valley, Christian passed by the cave of the two old giants. They were both dead now, and a young rat had come to live in their cave. His name was Maul. He knew Greatheart and hated him, and always tried to hinder him when he brought the pilgrims out of the valley. As Greatheart drew near the cave, Maul looked out, and seeing the pilgrims, he cried, "How often have you been forbidden to do this?" "To do what?" asked Greatheart. "You know what I mean," answered Maul angrily, "but I will put a stop to it." And seizing his great club, he came down the rocky path toward the way of the king. "We will not fight," said Greatheart quietly, "until you tell me why you are attacking me." "Because you are a robber," said the giant rat. "You carry off little children from the cities of my prince and take them into a strange country, and no one knows what will become of them." "I am a servant of the king," said Greatheart. "I am not a robber. My master has commanded me to bring the children safely home to him, and if you wish to fight me because I obey him, I am quite ready." When Maul heard this, he rushed suddenly upon Greatheart and struck the young badger, and such a terrible blow with his club that Greatheart fell to his knees. The poor little pilgrims gave a scream of fright, for they thought that their faithful guide would be killed. But Greatheart quickly sprung up again and wounded the giant's arm with his sword. After this, they had a long struggle, while the children watched and trembled, for although they knew that Greatheart was brave and trusted in the king to help him, they could see that the giant was young and strong, and they feared he might gain the victory. At last the giant became tired and would fight no longer, but he still refused to let Greatheart pass. He sat down by the wayside to rest, and Greatheart turned away and prayed to the king to give him new strength so that he might win the battle. The little pilgrims prayed also. Maul saw what they were doing, and I think it made him feel afraid, for he knew that the king heard the prayers of his servants, and that even little children had been sometimes able by his help to overcome the strongest giants. However, he determined to fight more fiercely than before, and he hoped that he would be able to kill Greatheart. If he could seize the little pilgrims and carry them back into the country of the wicked prince, he would receive a great reward. Chapter 72. Greatheart overcomes the giant. The king did not forsake Greatheart. When the fight began again, the lad felt that his strength and courage were increasing every moment, and before long he succeeded in bringing the giant to the ground. Maul cried for mercy, and Greatheart allowed him to rise. But as Maul got up, he struck at the young soldier with his club. The blow fell upon Greatheart's head, and if his helmet had been less strong, the blow might have killed him. After that, Maul's courage failed. Greatheart's sword had wounded him in the side, and he began to feel faint and could no longer hold his heavy club. It fell from his hands, and that ended the battle. In a few moments, Greatheart was standing alone upon the pathway, and the giant lay dead at his feet. The children were full of joy, for although the fight had been terrible to see, they knew that the giant was one of the king's enemies, and that it was right for Greatheart to kill him. Near to the cave in which he had lived, there was a large number of stones. The boys climbed up the rocks and rolled several of the stones down the pathway. They built them up into a pillar against which they placed the club of the giant, so that pilgrims who came out of the dark valley might see it and know that their enemy was dead. At a little distance from the cave, there was a great mound overlooking the plain. From it, Christian had seen Faithful, and when the children came to it, Greatheart advised them to sit down and rest and eat some of the fruit that had been brought from the house of the interpreter. As they sat comfortably upon the grass, Christiana asked him whether he had been wounded. "Not much," he replied. "My armor is so good. I have only a few cuts and bruises, which will soon be healed." "Were you not frightened when the giant struck you with his club?" said Christiana. "Yes, but I knew the king would help me. The good prince himself has often been wounded, but he has always conquered in the end, and he will not let his servants be overthrown if they are faithful to him." It was late now in the evening, and although it was summertime, the light was beginning to fade, so the little pilgrims were obliged to hasten on their journey. Many fine oak trees grew upon the plain, and some of them had stood quite close to the way of the king. As the children walked quickly along, they saw a very old cat sitting upon the ground under one of the trees. His staff was in his hand, but his eyes were closed, and he seemed to be asleep. "He is dressed like a pilgrim," said Matthew. "Yes," said Greatheart, "he is a pilgrim, and we must not leave him sleeping here." He touched the old cat's shoulder to awaken him, and the poor pilgrim sprung up trembling, for he thought an enemy was going to seize him. "What is it?" he cried. "Who are you?" Chapter 73. Mr. Honest. Greatheart was sorry that he had startled the old cat. "You need not be afraid of us," he said. "We are all friends." But the pilgrim was not satisfied. He looked anxiously at Greatheart and Matthew and asked again who they were. "My name is Greatheart," said the lad, "and I am taking these children to the celestial city." Then the old pilgrim smiled, for he had heard of Greatheart before. "I was afraid that you were robbers," he said, "but I see now that you are the king's servants." "What would you have done if we had been robbers?" said Greatheart. For the stranger did not look fit to defend himself. "I know I am only a feeble old cat," he replied, "but I would have fought, yes, I would have fought as long as I had any breath, and I do not think even you two strong lads would have overcome me." "You speak like a good pilgrim," said Greatheart. "Will you tell us your name?" The old cat shook his head. "Oh, never mind my name. I am only a poor fellow, and I used to live in a place called Stupidity, about 4 leagues from the City of Destruction." "Oh, is it you, Mr. Honest?" cried Greatheart, seizing his hand. "Well, yes," he replied, "my name is Honest, but it is only by the help of the king that I can be true to it." "How did you know anything about me?" "I have heard the good prince speaking of you," said Greatheart. And then the old pilgrim's face flushed all over with pleasure, for he loved the king's son with his whole heart. Like most good creatures, Mr. Honest was fond of children, and he soon made friends with the little pilgrims. They were pleased with his kind, good-natured face, and Christiana and Mercy thought that his long fur was very beautiful. As for Innocence, she was quite ready to hug him. As they went along in twilight, Greatheart talked to Mr. Honest of his pilgrimage and presently asked him if he remembered one of his old friends, a chicken named Fearing. "Yes, indeed," said the old cat. "I have often thought of him since the time when we lived near to each other. Has he reached the city safely?" "My master sent him with me from our house," replied Greatheart. "He was a very strange creature, for although he loved the king so dearly, he thought that he would be turned away from the gates of the celestial city. He fancied he was too weak and poor for the king to notice him, and that he would not be helped as the other pilgrims are. We were told that he stayed upon the plain for many days near the Slough of Despond, because he felt sure that he would sink in it. Many animals offered to lead him over it, but he only wept and and though he watched them cross in safety, he would not venture near it. But he did cross, said Mercy. Oh yes, after a long time. One bright morning he took courage, and when he reached the firm ground beyond the slough, he could scarcely believe that the danger was really past. Then, at the narrow gate, he behaved in the same way. He did not think he would be received, so he would not knock. Other pilgrims came to the gate, and Goodwill let them in, but Fearing drew back, so that the gatekeeper never saw him. At last he crept up to the gate and gave one timid knock. Goodwill came at once, and seeing no one, he stepped out onto the plain. Poor Fearing was trembling on the ground, but Goodwill lifted him up and spoke kindly to him. I am sure he would, said Mercy, for she remembered how she had been almost as timid herself before she entered the way of the king. Goodwill is a kind friend to everyone, said old Mr. Honest, but tell me how Fearing went on. I know very well what a strange chicken he was. Chapter 74. Fearing's Pilgrimage. The rest of Fearing's story was soon told. Goodwill wrote a letter to the interpreter asking him to send a guide with the poor chicken from his house to the celestial city. But Fearing spent several days and nights outside the interpreter's gates before anyone knew that he was there. Then one morning, Greatheart happened to see him from one of the windows and went down to speak to him. He was cold and weak for want of food, but he brought out his letter, and after a little trouble, Greatheart persuaded him to enter the house. And you were with him always from that time, said Honest. Yes, and he was pleased when we came to the cross, and he did not mind the hill of difficulty or the wolves. He was not afraid of such things. He only feared lest the king shouldn't think him to be a fit pilgrim. At the Palace Beautiful, he was very happy. He would not have much to do with the family or with their guests, but he liked to hear them talk. You know there is a large screen in the hall, and he used to sit behind it, where he couldn't be seen, and listen to what was said. We stayed a long time in the Valley of Humiliation, for my master told me not to hurry him, and he seemed to love the grass and flowers so much that he could not bear to leave them. How did he go when he passed through the dark valley? I was afraid it would be terrible to him, and indeed it was, but the king did not allow him to be troubled by it as many pilgrims are. I never saw the valley so light or so quiet at any other time. In Vanity Fair, he was angry at the wickedness he saw around him. He was braver there than anywhere, and ready to fight the enemies of the king at every turn. However, we passed through the town without being hurt, and after travelling slowly for several weeks, we came to the river. Was he not satisfied when he saw the gate of the celestial city? Not a bit. He wandered along the shore, looking across the bright walls and crying that he would never be received there. He was sure that he would be lost in the river. But when the message came for him, I went down to watch him crossing, and the water was so low that he went over quite easily. Then the Shining Ones met him, and I saw him no more. Mr. Honest seemed glad to hear of his old friend's pilgrimage, and that he had reached the city safely. When Greatheart had finished his story, Christiana said, I thought perhaps other pilgrims did not feel as afraid, lest the king should not receive them. I have felt that way so often. So have I, said Mercy. I have too, said Matthew, and I wondered whether the king would be displeased with me for it. No, replied Greatheart, he will not be displeased. I think all good pilgrims feel anxious sometimes. If they were quite satisfied with themselves, said Honest, it would show that they were not the king's true servants. I once travelled a little way with such a pilgrim. His name was Self-Will. and he never troubled himself at all about pleasing the king. He thought he need only follow this path until he came to the city, and he would surely be received there. While Mr. Honest was talking about this foolish pilgrim, a traveller passed by who said to Greatheart, "You must be careful, for there are some robbers about tonight upon this plain." Greatheart was glad of the warning, and both he and Matthew kept watch as they went along. But they did not meet the robbers, who had perhaps heard of Greatheart and would not venture to attack him. Chapter 75. The House of Gaius. Innocence was now sound asleep with her head on her sister's shoulder, and the two little boys were beginning to fret after their long day. The sun had set and the stars were shining overhead, but Christiana did not like the thought of sleeping out of doors, and she asked Greatheart whether he knew of a house where they could rest. "There is a friend of mine," said Honest, "a squirrel named Gaius, who lives close to the way of the king. We shall soon be in sight of his house, and I am sure he will give us lodging." Gaius received the little band of pilgrims kindly. He always kept several rooms for use of the travellers, and his servants were as pleased as their master to have the chance of entertaining the king's pilgrims. While the cook was preparing supper, he brought his guests into his own parlour, where they were glad to sit down and rest. He had much to say to his old friend Mr. Honest, and also to Greatheart, and the children listened quietly and felt happy. Presently a maid came in and spread a cloth upon the table and laid out the plates and the bread. Then the cook sent up the supper, and the hungry travellers were thankful to see the good food placed before them: mushrooms and potatoes, milk and butter and honey, and a dish of large rosy apples. When Matthew saw the fruit, he blushed, for he thought of the poisoned apples that had made him so ill when he was at the Palace Beautiful. "May we eat them?" he asked. "Oh yes," replied Gaius, "they are wholesome fruit." Then Matthew told him why he was afraid. "But those were poisoned apples," said Gaius. "These are from the king's orchards and will hurt no one." After supper, Gaius gave the boys some nuts to crack, and while they ate them, he went on talking to Greatheart. At last, Christiana thought it would be better for the little ones to go up to bed, and she was also tired herself. So Gaius showed her the rooms that had been made ready, one for her and Mercy, and one for the boys. And before long they were all asleep in their comfortable beds. As for Mr. Honest, he was so pleased to see his old friend again that he sat by the fire all night and talked to him, and Greatheart sat with him until the sun rose and the servants began to put the house in order for the day. While they were at breakfast, Gaius told his guests of a wicked giant toad named Slaygood, who had come to live among the hills about a mile from his house. "He is very strong and fierce," said Gaius, "but if you would go with me to attack him, I am sure the king would help us and give us strength to destroy him." So Christiana and Mercy and the little ones were left to spend the morning quietly in the house, and Gaius took Greatheart and Matthew to look for the giant. Mr. Honest went with them, for although he was very old, he was very brave, and he liked to see the king's enemies put to flight. Now it happened that the day before the giant had seized a poor pilgrim named Feeble-Mind, and when Gaius and his party appeared, Slaygood was just preparing to kill the groundhog. But the giant toad was obliged to come out of his cave to defend himself when the little party of the king's servants began to attack him. Feeble-Mind lay quite still in the darkness, and when he heard the sound of voices he rejoiced, for he felt sure that the king had sent someone to save his life. The battle lasted for an hour, but Slaygood was overcome at last, and Gaius searched the cave carefully to see whether any captives were hidden there. Feeble Mind was soon found and carried back to the house, and when he had eaten some food and rested a little, he was able to tell his story. Chapter 76, Feeble Mind and Ready to Halt. Feeble Mind had never been a strong groundhog, and he seemed scarcely fit to take a long journey. But, said he, I have made up my mind that I will find the king's city, and if I am too weak to walk all the way, I will creep on my hands and knees. Everyone has been good to me, and I have come thus far in safety. I could not have climbed the hill of difficulty, but the interpreter sent a servant with me, and he carried me on his back to the top of the rocky path. This is the worst thing that has happened to me, but as I lay in the giant's cave last night, I prayed to the king, and I felt sure he would save me. And you see, he has saved me. Gaius had a daughter whose name was Phoebe. She wished very much to go to the celestial city, and her father thought that it would be pleasant for her to travel with Christiana and Mercy. So they stayed a few days while she prepared for her journey. On the last day, Gaius made a feast for them, and when it was over, Greatheart asked what he must pay for their lodging. But Gaius would not take any money. He said he loved the king, and for his sake he had kept the house open to any pilgrims who chose to stay there. When the children were saying goodbye, Greatheart saw Feeble Mind standing silently in the doorway, and he said to him, Are you not coming with us? The king will be glad for us to help you on your way. Feeble Mind shook his head. I am afraid I should hinder you, he replied. You are all strong and active, and I am so weak. I am not merry as these children are, and I should make them feel sad with my dull ways. Oh no, you will not, cried Christiana. Do come with us, and we will cheer and help you. Yes, said Greatheart, it is not wise for you to travel alone. We shall be grieved if we have to leave you behind. The tears came into the poor groundhog's eyes, but he could not make up his mind to go with Greatheart, for he was really afraid of hindering the little pilgrims by his weakness. However, while they were all standing together on the pathway, they heard the sound of footsteps approaching, and another pilgrim came into sight. He was a rabbit, and his name was Ready to Halt. He was quite a lad, but he was so lame that he had to walk with crutches. When Feeble Mind saw him, he exclaimed, Oh, how did you come here? For he had known him before. The rabbit smiled as he held out his hand. How did you come up here? He said. I think we are both bound for the same place. You are lame and I am weak, replied Feeble Mind. But the king will not turn us away from the gates of his city. I was just wishing for a companion, and no one could suit me better than you. I shall be only too glad to go with you, said Ready to Halt. Then Greatheart and Mr. Honest spoke to him, and soon everything was settled pleasantly. We cannot travel very far, said Greatheart, but if you are not able to keep pace with us, we can always wait for you. So the little party set off once more. Mr. Honest walked ahead with Greatheart and Matthew, and his two brothers followed him. Then came Christiana and Mercy and Phoebe with little Innocents, and last of all, Ready to Halt and Feeble Mind. I'm sure we will be able to help each other, said Ready to Halt, and when you are tired, I will lend you one of my crutches. Chapter 77, Crossing the Plain. The pilgrims spent the day in crossing the plain, and after walking for several hours, they saw the walls and gates of Vanity Fair in the distance before them. The great towers rose darkly against the clear sky, and Christiana began to feel timid as she drew near the city of the wicked prince. It is such a dreadful place, she said. Did not poor Faithful die there? Asked Mercy. Yes, answered Phoebe, the animals treated him cruelly, and they kept little Christian in prison for some time. Do you think that we should be put in prison? Said Mercy. Christiana's face grew pale and she clasped Innocence more closely to her in her arms. If we are separated from each other, she said, do not let us forget all that has happened while we have been together. The King has been very good to us, and we know that he is always watching over us. If we have to suffer, we might be brave and patient because we love him. Feeble Mind and Ready to Halt were walking just behind the girls and could hear all they said. Are you afraid? Asked Feeble Mind. I think we are, replied Christiana. Shall we be obliged to pass through the city? Said Mercy. Is there no other way? Ready to Halt looked kindly at the trembling little squirrel. We might go around, he said, but then we might not find our way into the right path again. I think we must go straight on, said Phoebe. I have heard my father say that the animals are less rough than they used to be. The wicked prince has told them to make things seem pleasant in the city so that the pilgrims may feel inclined to give up their journey. Great Heart and Mr. Honest turned round at this moment and waited for the rest of the little party to overtake them. We shall have to spend the night in Vanity Fair, said Great Heart, for if we pass straight through the city, we shall not be able to reach another safe resting place before the darkness comes on. Where can we sleep? Asked Christiana. Will not the townsfolk ill-treat us? I think not, replied Great Heart. I have brought many pilgrims safely through the city, and I know someone who will give us lodgings and be very pleased to see us. Does he love the King? Asked Mercy. Yes, the King has commanded him to live there, so that he may keep an inn for the use of the pilgrims. Why did not Christian and Faithful go there? The city was more dangerous then, and it was not safe for any of the King's servants to live in it. But now that the townsfolk have grown quieter, they have allowed a few good animals to build houses in the fair. What can they do in such a place? Said Matthew. Is it not wrong for them to live there? No, the King has given them work to do for him, even in this wicked city. They help and protect the pilgrims who are passing through it, and when any of them attempted to stay here, these servants of the King search for them and try to persuade them to continue their pilgrimage. Oh, said Christiana, it is comforting to hear of this. We were feeling so frightened, for we thought that the townsfolk might put us in prison or even kill us, as they killed Faithful. They will not kill you, said Great Heart, and if we pass quietly through the streets, they will not try to hinder us. Chapter 78. In Vanity Fair. It was a bright summer evening and the city looked beautiful in the light of the setting sun. The buildings were all large and grand. Pretty flags fluttered upon the walls and towers and housetops. The townsfolk wore rich clothes, and even little boys no older than James and Joseph were dressed in suits of silk and velvet and wore large caps with long, drooping feathers. I should like one of those caps, whispered Joseph. Phoebe heard the whisper, and she took the little rabbit's hand in her own. Don't be foolish, Joseph, she said. The nice clothes do not make the boys any happier. Your white suit is really more beautiful than the brightest of these. And you know that you could not be received at the gates of the celestial city if you wore clothes belonging to the wicked prince. The town was less busy in the early part of the evening than at any other time of the day. Most of the young animals were tired of playing and lay idly in sunny corners, talking and teasing each other. They laughed at the pilgrims, but they did not crowd around them or try to prevent their passing through the streets. And even the grown-ups took very little notice of them. They soon reached the marketplace where poor little Faithful had suffered. After crossing this wide space, Great Heart led them into a quiet street and stopped before the house of his friend, whose name was Mason. Mason had no sons of his own, and he was always pleased to see Great Heart. Come in, he cried. You know that you are welcome. How far have you travelled today? "From the house of Gaius," replied Greatheart, "and it has been so hot upon the plain that we are all tired and shall be very glad if you can give us lodging and food." "I will give you the best I have," said Mason. He led them into a large, cool room where they could sit quietly and rest while he ordered a meal to be prepared for them. When the supper was nearly ready, the kind innkeeper called his eldest daughter Grace and desired her to go to the houses of the king's servants and tell them that some pilgrims had arrived in the city and were staying with him. Grace did so, and presently several of these good servants came in, and the evening was spent in talking of the king and of all he had done for Christiana and her companions. In the morning, Mason begged Greatheart to remain in his house for a few days. And when that time was over, a message was brought from the king desiring the pilgrims to stay in the city for some weeks longer. Mason and his two daughters, Grace and Martha, were kind to their guests, and the children soon found friends among the king's servants. As for old Mr. Honest, feeble-minded and ready to halt, they were all glad to have a long rest before continuing their journey. The boys were able to make themselves useful in many ways, and the girls spent their spare time, as they had done at the Palace Beautiful, by sewing for the poor. For although most of the animals in Vanity Fair were richly dressed, there were some who had wasted all their money and were clothed only in rags. And these miserable creatures were thankful to anyone who could help them. Grace and Martha used to visit many of them and take them food and new garments, and tell them of the king and his goodness. Christiana and Mercy and Phoebe were glad to help in this good work, so that the days they spent in Vanity Fair were both busy and happy. Chapter 79. The Great Dragon. Next to the city of Vanity Fair there was a large forest, and in this forest lived a terrible dragon. It was fierce and cruel, and the townsfolk were much afraid of it. It was so bold that it often came into the midst of the town and attacked the animals, and sometimes it seized little ones and carried them away to its den. The servants of the wicked prince hated this dragon, but none of them were brave enough to resist it. When they heard its roaring, they fled and tried to hide themselves, so that the savage creature grew more and more bold in its attacks upon them. But the servants of the king had made up their minds to destroy it if they could, and when they heard that Greatheart was staying in the house of Mason, they determined to ask him to go out with them. Greatheart was willing to help them, and one morning the little party went forth in search of the dragon. It came out of the forest to meet them, and did not seem to be in the least afraid of them. Indeed, it was so strong that it could easily have killed them all if they had not been armed with the king's weapons. However, they fought against it with all their might, and although they were not able to hurt it much in the first battle, they drove it back into its den. There it lay for several days, angry and frightened, and did not venture to approach the city. While Greatheart stayed in Vanity Fair, he went out 3 or 4 times with the king's servants to fight the dragon, and before they left the city, they succeeded in wounding it so that so much of its strength and power were lost. You may be sure that the townsfolk were very glad when they knew this, and that even though they were wicked animals, they could not help honouring Greatheart and his companions for their bravery. At last the time came for the pilgrims to continue their journey. Their friends were sorry to part from them and gave them many presents. Grace and Martha, Mason's 2 daughters, had been waiting for a guide to help take them to the celestial city. So their father asked Greatheart whether he would allow them to travel with Christiana. Greatheart answered that it would be pleasant for them to do so. Many of the king's servants came to the gates of the city to bid the pilgrims farewell, and Christiana could not help thinking how good the king had been in making everyone be so kind to her and her companions. "We might have been treated no better than Christian and Faithful were," she said to Mercy. "I was afraid that we should be put in prison. But you see, we have found friends even here, and the king has kept us safe in the midst of this wicked city. Chapter 80. Christiana leaves innocence at the house in the valley. The beautiful Valley of Peace was only a day's journey from Vanity Fair, and the Pilgrims spent the next night in its quiet meadows. In the morning, Greatheart told Christiana that the king had built a house in this valley, where the baby pilgrims were cared for and taught by kind and good creatures until they were old enough to travel to the celestial city. "Do you mean I ought to leave innocence there?" asked Christiana. "It would be wise of you to do so," answered Greatheart. "She is too young to spend all her days in travelling, and you know how hard the path is for her tender little feet." "But I can carry her," said Christiana. "Not all the way," said Greatheart very gently, for he saw the tears in the girl's eyes. "I am sure you love innocence, don't you?" "Yes." "The king loves her more than you do, and he thinks it is better for his little ones to gain strength and wisdom in this quiet valley before they set out on their journey. Shall I have to go into the city without her? I thought we should pass all through the gates together." "No, the king generally sends for his pilgrims one by one. Innocence will likely come to live with you in the land of delight. But even if you have to cross the river without her, you need not be troubled, for you may be quite sure that she is safe and happy. I will take you today to see the king's house." Poor Christiana felt very sad, but she loved the king too well to disobey him. And when she had seen the kind creatures who took care of the little pilgrims and the sunny rooms and beautiful gardens in which they lived, she grew more content. The next day she carried Innocence across the meadows and led her up the pathway to the door of the king's house. A gentle-looking cat came out to meet her, and Christiana said, "I have brought my little sister, for Greatheart thinks she is too young to travel any farther with us." The nurse saw the tears in Christiana's eyes, and she answered, "You do not like to part with her." "No, I have no other sister, and I thought we should always be together." "Dear little rabbit," said the cat, "I do not wonder that you love her. She will be very happy here, and it will not be long before she is strong enough to follow you." Then she took Innocence in her arms and asked Christiana to come into the house with her. Christiana stayed there all day, and in the evening, when she had seen Innocence sleeping peacefully in her little cot, she went back again through the valley to the place where the other children were staying. Greatheart came part of the way to meet her, and he was so kind and gentle that Christiana felt comforted. "I know the king's servants will teach her better than I can," she said, "and the path is very rough sometimes." "Yes," replied Greatheart, "and you cannot carry her always. It is right that she should learn to walk alone. When you see her again, you will feel glad that you turned her in to the care of the king." Then she told Christiana that the king's son, the good prince, whom they all loved so dearly, came often to see the children and spend much of his time in teaching them and in leading them up and down in the broad meadows. When they are tired, he carries them tenderly in his arms. Chapter 81. Doubting Castle. When the little pilgrims reached the stile that led into Bypath Meadow, they saw the stone that Christian and Hopeful had placed by the wayside. The children were tired from walking, for that part of the road was very rough, so they sat down to rest for a little while and soon began to talk about the dreadful giant Despair. "Why does not someone kill him?" said Joseph. "We are not strong enough, are we?" said James, looking at Greatheart. "But you could kill the biggest giant, couldn't you?" Greatheart smiled. "Only with the help of the king," he answered, "and the king would help you if you trusted in him." "So that we could even kill giant Despair?" "Yes." "Let us try," exclaimed Joseph eagerly. He was very cruel to little Christian. "Perhaps there are some pilgrims shut up in the castle now," said Mercy. "But it is not wrong to leave the way of the king?" asked Christiana. "If the boys really wish to fight with giant Despair, the king will not be displeased," answered Greatheart. Christian and Hopeful went into the meadow of their own leisure, so they fell into trouble. "Then do you think we may go?" asked Matthew. "Yes, if you are ready to fight like a brave soldier." The boys were only too eager to follow Greatheart to Doubting Castle, and old Mr. Honest said he must certainly go with them. Feeble Mind and Ready to Halt would not have been able to fight, so they stayed by the wayside with Christiana and the other girls. The little party was soon out of sight, and it was quite late in the day when they returned. They were full of triumph, and they brought 2 poor pilgrims with them, whom they had rescued from the cruel giant. One was an old mouse with a sad and weary face. He had been lying for many weeks in the dark dungeon, and even the grey evening light seemed to dazzle his weak eyes. He looked pale and faint, and when he had been brought safely into the way of the king, he had to lie down upon the grass, while Christiana and her friends rubbed his cold hands and fed him with wholesome bread and drink. Presently, he revived a little and was able to sit up and thank his deliverers. He told them that his name was Despondency, and that he had been travelling to the Celestial City with his daughter, Much Afraid. The poor young mouse had done her best to comfort her father in his distress, but they had both lost all hope of being saved and could scarcely believe that Greatheart was a servant of the king and that they were really free once more. "Did you kill the giant?" whispered Mercy to Matthew. "Yes, and his wife too. She and her husband were cruel and evil." "Oh, Mercy, the castle was such a dreadful place." "I am glad we did not fall into the giant's hands," said Mercy. "That poor girl looks as if she would die even now." "She will soon grow stronger if we take care of her." "Did you destroy the castle?" "We broke down all the gates and doors." "You must have been frightened at the giant." "He was rough and savage, but we prayed to the king, and even little Joseph fought bravely. It was our first real battle," and the lad's eyes shone as he put his sword back into his sheath. Chapter 82: The Delectable Mountains. Greatheart had now quite a large party of pilgrims under his care. Good Mr. Honest took charge of Despondency, and Much Afraid, although she was older than any of the other girls, was glad of their pleasant company. The shepherds who lived upon the Delectable Mountains saw the pilgrims coming toward their tents, and were pleased to find that Greatheart was with them. All the king's servants knew and loved him, for he was such a gentle and faithful guide. It was a clear, bright night, but as Despondency and his daughter were so weak after their long imprisonment, Greatheart thought it wise to remain with the shepherds until the next day. These kind shepherds welcomed the whole party to their tents, gave them food, and prepared beds for them, so that in the morning they rose up refreshed and strengthened. The shepherds were always glad when any of the king's pilgrims came to stay with them, and they liked to take their visitors to see the view of the Celestial City and the many strange places upon the mountains. Christiana and her friends enjoyed their walk upon the hills very much, and when they had seen all the wonderful sights that had been shown to Christian and Hopeful, there was still a little time to spare before they continued their journey. So instead of turning back to the tents, the shepherds led the pilgrims to a very beautiful hill called Mount Innocence. Not far from where they stood, a figure was walking upon the green slope. He was clothed in white, and his garments had not a single spot or stain upon them. But while the pilgrims watched him, 2 others came across the mountain, and when they saw the white robes, they filled their hands with earth and began to pelt him with it. "Oh," cried the children, "they will spoil his beautiful clothes." "No," said the shepherds, "the king will prevent that." And as the creature in white robes came nearer, the pilgrims saw that the dirt, although it struck his clothes, fell from them without leaving the slightest stain. "There is a lesson in that," said Mr. Honest. "Yes," said Greatheart, "a very good lesson for all pilgrims. When wicked animals speak of them, they need not be unhappy, for the king will not allow false words to do them any real harm." "And you may remember also," said the shepherds, "that it is only by our own fault that the clothes the king gives us can be stained. None of our enemies have any power to spoil them." After this, the shepherds took their visitors to Mount Charity. A good animal lived there whose work was to provide garments for some of the king's servants who were very poor indeed. He showed the pilgrims a wonderful roll of cloth that the king had given him to use. Every day he cut from it as many garments as were needed, and yet the cloth never came to an end. "It is very strange," said Christiana as she watched him at his work. "The king's power and goodness are so wonderful," said the shepherds. "Those who really try to help his poor servants may be sure that their stores will never fail." Chapter 83. The Wonderful Glass. Although the shepherds lived in tents during the summer, they also had a large and beautiful house which the king had given into their care in order that it might be used as a place of rest for his pilgrims. When the children returned from their walk upon the mountain, they found dinner prepared for them in this house, and as soon as the meal was over, Greatheart desired them to get ready for their journey. Mercy had eaten very little dinner, and she looked so pale and sad that Christiana whispered, "What's the matter, Mercy? Are you ill?" Tears came into Mercy's eyes, but she shook her head and said nothing. "What is it?" asked Christiana. "Don't cry. Tell me what is troubling you." "It isn't right for me to wish for things," said Mercy with a little sob, "but you have your beautiful anchor, and I saw something just now I should like to have." "What did you see? Perhaps it is something we may ask for." "It is a wonderful glass mirror set in a handle of ornate gold. I looked at it in the dining room before dinner. You can see yourself in it, but when you turn it around, you don't see yourself anymore, but our dear good prince instead. It is so beautiful. There is the crown of thorns upon his head, and he seems to smile at me, and I feel as if I could not be happy unless I had it." Christiana felt puzzled. "The shepherds are kind," she said. "Perhaps if they knew you wished for it, they might be willing to let us have it." "I could buy it, you know," said Mercy. "I have a little money." "Well, don't cry any more. I will ask the shepherds about it." So Mercy dried her tears, and in a few moments Experience came toward her. He spoke gently and laid his hand kindly on her shoulder. "Christiana says you have seen something in our house that you would like to have for your own. Tell me what it is. The king will be glad that we should give it to you." Shy little Mercy blushed, but she looked up at the shepherd and answered, "It is the glass in the dining room in which you can see the good prince." Sincere had followed Experience, and when he heard what Mercy said, he went at once into the house and brought out the glass. Mercy scarcely knew what to say when it was placed in her hands, but the shepherds saw how timid she was, and they understood quite well that she was too happy and grateful for many words. Then these kind shepherds brought out of their treasuries a present for each of the pilgrims, and after wishing them a pleasant journey, they watched the little party until it was all out of sight. You remember that Christian and Hopeful received a map from the country, and that the shepherds gave them directions? Christiana and her companions did not need any map, because Greatheart was with them, and he knew the way of the king, and could warn the pilgrims when they came to any dangerous places. Chapter 84. Valiant. When Christian and Hopeful were travelling together, Christian had told his friend the story of Little Faith, who had foolishly lain down to sleep by the wayside and had been robbed by some wicked boys. Greatheart and the pilgrims came presently to the very place where Little Faith had slept. It was at the corner of a lane, which led out of the way of the king into the country of the wicked prince. As they drew near, they saw a rabbit standing alone with his sword in his hand, and his armour stained with blood. Greatheart stopped and asked him what had happened. The rabbit was tall and strong, with a brave, handsome face, and as Christiana looked at him, she felt sure that she had seen him somewhere before. "My name is Valiant," he answered, "and I am a pilgrim. 3 animals came down this lane and attacked me as I was passing. They said I might take my choice of 3 things, either join them in robbing the king's pilgrims, to go back to my own city, or to be put to death on the spot." "What did you say to them?" asked Greatheart. "I told them that I had always tried to be honest, and I certainly should not become a thief now, and that as for my own city, I should not have left if I had been happy there. But it was a bad place, and I have forsaken it forever." Then they asked me if I wished to lose my life, and I said my life was worth too much for me to give up lightly, and that they had no right to meddle with the king's servants in such a manner. So they drew their swords and I drew mine, and we have been fighting for nearly 3 hours. They have wounded me, but I think I wounded them also. And I suppose they must have heard your steps in the distance, although I did not, for they suddenly turned and fled away, and then I saw you coming." "That was a hard battle, 3 to 1, said Greatheart. "Yes," replied Valiant, "but I know I was fighting against my king's enemies, and that gave me courage." "Did you not cry for help? Some of the king's servants might have been near enough to hear you." "I cried to the king himself, and I am sure he answered me. I could not have fought so long in my own strength." Greatheart smiled. "You are one of our king's true servants. Let me see your sword. Ah, yes, this is from the right armoury." "It is a good sword," said Valiant. "No one who had such a weapon need be afraid, if he has learned how to use it skillfully." "And you fought for 3 hours, said Greatheart. "Were you not ready to faint with fatigue?" "No, I fought until my sword clung to my hand, as if it were a part of my arm, but I think that made me feel stronger." "You have been very brave," answered Greatheart. "You must finish your journey with us. We shall all be glad of your company." Mr. Honest, Despondency, and the children all joined in welcoming the brave soldier. Christiana washed his wounds, and Mercy and Phoebe helped her bind them up. After this they brought him food and drink and made him rest for a little while. Then, as evening was coming on, they started once more on their journey. Chapter 85. Christian's Father. Christiana was walking just behind Greatheart and Valiant, and she could hear all that the pilgrims said in answer to the questions of the young guide. She was still wondering where she had seen him before, when she heard him say that he had once lived in the City of Destruction. "What made you become a pilgrim?" asked Greatheart. "I had a little son," replied Valiant, "and when he knew that his mother was living with the king, he never rested until he had found out how to follow her. He went away one morning, and we did not miss him until it was too late for us to overtake him and bring him back." "What was his name?" asked Greatheart. And Christiana listened eagerly for the answer, for she felt sure now that she knew who the soldier was. "Christian," he answered. "I was very grieved when I heard that what had happened, and it was many months before we had any certain news of him. Then an animal named Truth came to the city, and he met me one day and told me how my brave little son had travelled safely along the way of the king and had reached the dark river and crossed it, and had been received by the shining ones at the gates of the celestial city. He told me also that the child and his mother were living happily in the presence of the king. And when I heard this, I began to feel restless and sad. The service of the wicked prince was no longer pleasant to me, and I forsook him and became a pilgrim." "Did you come in at the narrow gate?" "Yes, for Truth had told me that I could not be received by the king unless I did so." Greatheart turned around and looked at Christiana with a smile. "You see," he said, "the king has fulfilled little Christian's wish." Then Valiant turned also. "Did you know my little boy?" he asked. Christiana answered with tears in her eyes, for she knew how the child had longed for his father to follow him. "Ah," said Valiant, "it would give him great pleasure when he comes to the gates of the city and finds so many of his friends are waiting to enter." Greatheart and the soldier went on talking for some time, and Christiana listened to Valiant's account of his pilgrimage. He had always been brave and diligent in his work, so that his master, the wicked prince, had been unwilling to lose so good a servant. His companions had done everything they could to keep him at his post in the city of destruction, and they had tried to frighten him by telling him of the dangers he would meet if he became a pilgrim. They told him of the fierce giants and the wolves and the hill of difficulty and the enchanted ground and the net of the flatterer and of the dark river over which there was no bridge and which must be passed before he could enter the celestial city. They reminded him also of many pilgrims who would gladly return to their homes after entering the long distance upon the way of the king. And they denied that the story of his son's happiness was true, for they knew that he had certainly been lost in the dark river and had never reached the opposite shore at all. "Did not all these things discourage you?" asked Greatheart. "No," replied Valiant, "I felt that Truth could not possibly be deceiving me. So I left the city and began my journey." "And you have not been sorry?" "No, indeed. I have met with many enemies, and I have trusted in the king, and he has helped me to conquer them all." Chapter 86. The Enchanted Ground. Although the enchanted ground was a pleasant place in which pilgrims were tempted to rest after the toils of their journey, they sometimes found the path across it full of difficulty and trouble. The air was so warm and still that it made everyone sleepy, and the servants of the wicked prince had built many little arbours in the hope that foolish pilgrims would lie down to rest in them and so fall into the hands of their enemies. They had also planted a number of briars close to the way of the king, and these had flourished so well that their long prickly branches were all trailing over the pathway, and Christiana and her companions had to pick their way among them very carefully indeed. There had been a heavy storm of rain in the early morning, which had left the path quite wet. Between the mud and the thorns, the poor children began to feel quite faint and discouraged. Greatheart and Valiant did their best to cheer the weary little company. Greatheart went first and made Feeble Mind lean upon his arm, and Mr. Valiant came last of all, leading Despondency, who was still weak and unable to get on comfortably by himself. Soon they passed by a large and beautiful arbour, and I think if the children had been alone, they might have been tempted to enter it. The walls were neatly made, and the roof had been covered that morning with fresh green boughs, which made it look cool and pleasant. But the pilgrims had learned to trust their wise young guide, and he had warned them that they must not think of sleeping until they had safely crossed this dangerous plain. Night came on while they were in the midst of the enchanted ground, and this made travelling more difficult, for the air was damp and foggy, and the moon was not shining. However, Greatheart led them slowly along, and presently he desired them to stand for a few minutes. "We are coming to a place where several paths lead out of the way of the king," said he, "and it is so dark I must look carefully at my map, or we may turn out of the road and be lost." He struck a light and drew out his little map, and as he looked before him at the path, he saw a pit filled with mud, which the wicked soldiers had dug just where the pilgrims would have to pass. If they had gone on in the darkness, one of them would have been sure to fall into it and might have been smothered before anyone could have drawn them out. Not far from the pit was another arbour, and in it lay 2 pilgrims, sleeping soundly. These were lads about Matthew's age, and as Greatheart looked at them, he said, "We must try to awaken them." But although he called them by their names, for he knew who they were, they did not hear him, and at last he took them by the shoulders and shook them. This roused them a little, and one of them murmured, "I will pay you when I get some money." And the other said, "I will fight as long as I can hold a sword." Then they settled themselves to sleep again. Greatheart turned away, for he saw that they could not be awakened. "What did they mean?" asked Christiana. "They did not know what they were saying," he answered. "They're in the power of the wicked prince, and he will not let them understand the danger until it is too late for them to escape from it." Chapter 87. Another Pilgrim. It was now so dark that the pilgrims could scarcely find their way, so they begged Greatheart to light his lantern. With this to guide and cheer them, they travelled more comfortably, but the girls and the 2 little boys were growing tired, and they began to pray to the king to help them in their weariness. Presently, a cool, fresh breeze sprung up, and as it blew across the plain, the air became clearer, and although the moon was still hidden by the clouds, the children could see and each other as they walked along. "Have we nearly crossed the plain?" asked Christiana. "Not yet," replied Greatheart, "but this is your last night of travel. Tomorrow we shall reach the land of delight, and you will be able to rest there without fear of danger." "When shall we go to the celestial city?" asked James. "I do not know," answered Greatheart. "The king may send for you very soon, or he may give you work to do for him in the land of delight, or he may perhaps send you to help other pilgrims on their journey." "To be guides and fight giants as you have done for us?" asked Joseph eagerly. "Perhaps when you are older," said Greatheart, smiling, "but I cannot tell you what the king may think is best for you. I only know that you will be happy, and that whatever he desires you to do for him, you will love to do it." Before the sun rose, while the light was still dim, the pilgrims heard a sound as if someone was speaking not far from them. They went on quietly, and soon they saw a young cat upon his knees by the wayside, with his face turned toward the sky. They knew he was praying to the king, and as he did not seem to hear their steps, they walked slowly, so that they might not disturb him by passing. In a few moments he got up and began to run toward the celestial city. But Greatheart, seeing that he was a pilgrim, called to him to wait for them. "Ah," said old Mr. Honest when the lad turned around, "I know him." "Do you?" asked Valiant. "Who is he?" "He comes from my own city," replied Honest. "His name is Steadfast, and he is one of the king's true pilgrims." Standfast exclaimed also when he caught sight of the old cat. "What, Father Honest?" he cried. Are you a pilgrim too?" "Yes, indeed," replied Honest. "It does me good to see you," said he, grasping his hand. "And it does me good to see you," returned Honest, "seeking the help of your king like a faithful servant." "Have you been in danger?" asked Valiant, "or were you thanking the king for his mercies?" "I was in danger," answered Steadfast, and then he told his new friends what had happened to him. Chapter 88. Folly. You remember how the flatterer met Christian and Hopeful upon the enchanted ground and tried to lead them astray? The wicked prince knew that when the pilgrims reached the land of delight, he would no longer be able to trouble them. So he employed very many of his servants in tempting the king's servants while they were upon this plain. Steadfast had been met by a girl whose name was Folly. She was very pretty and had a pleasant way of talking. "You look tired," she had said to him, "and I am sure you must be lonely. Let me walk with you and be your friend." But Steadfast knew by her fancy clothing and careless manner that she was not a pilgrim, and he would have nothing to say to her. He walked on silently, and she walked beside him, smiling and saying pleasant things until at last he grew angry and told her not to trouble him. When she heard his angry words, she laughed and bade him follow her. "I will teach you how to be really happy," she said, "if you will promise to do what I tell you." But Steadfast would not listen to her, and when he found that she was determined not to leave him, he knelt down upon the road and prayed for the king to deliver him from her temptations. "I felt sure the king would help me," said Steadfast, "and he did so by letting you overtake me just at the right moment. I did not hear your steps, but the girl must have seen you, for she suddenly turned and went away. Then I thanked the king for his goodness, and I was going to hurry on my way when I heard you call to me." "I believe I have seen the girl," said Mr. Honest, "or perhaps I have read of her in one of the king's books." "You may have done both," said Standfast. "She told me her name was Folly." "Ah," replied Honest, "she is tall, is she not? And her eyes and hair are dark?" "Yes," said Standfast. "She smiles when she speaks, and she has a purse filled with gold right fastened to her belt. She is always turning over the money with her fingers, and she loves to touch it." "Yes, she is just like that." "I thought I knew something of her. She is a dangerous enemy." "Indeed she is," said Greatheart. "Although she is so young, she does more mischief upon the enchanted ground than any other of the wicked prince's servants. She spends most of her time here, but she is sometimes met with upon the plain near the narrow gate, where she calls herself Pleasure and tries to hinder children who are looking for the way of the king. I could tell you many stories of pilgrims who have been deceived by her." "I saw that she was not a good companion," said Standfast, "but I did not know that I was in such danger." "Bad companions are always dangerous," replied Greatheart. "You did well to pray to the king, for you would have found it difficult to escape from her." Chapter 89. A Happy Morning. The sun had now risen, and as the pilgrims drew near to the borders of the plain, they saw before them the soft light, the beautiful hills that lay above the dark river. The river itself was not in sight, and they could not yet see the glory of the celestial city, but they knew that the golden gates were not far away, and that, when they had entered the land of delight, all the troubles and dangers of their pilgrimage would be over. "I am glad I came with you," whispered Mercy as she slipped her hand in Christiana's. "I have often been frightened, but now I am quite happy." "Yes," said Christiana, "we could never have been so happy in our old home." Then she looked around at her brothers. Matthew had grown taller since his illness, and his face was more thoughtful. But the change in him pleased his sister. "I think Matthew will be a little like Greatheart in a year or two, don't you?" she said. Perhaps the king will give him the same work to do, suggested Mercy. To guide the pilgrims? Ah, that is the best work of all. If he could ever be wise enough. Do you think Greatheart was wise at first? He must have been taught, or he could not know so much about the king and his will. And Matthew is so kind and gentle. He will be a good guide. Perhaps he would, said Christiana. He is brave now that he really loves the king. The little boys were tired after travelling all night, but the journey had done them good, for their sturdy figures were a pleasant sight. Then Christiana thought of innocence in the Valley of Peace and wondered how long it would be before the little ones came to live with her in the sunny land of delight. All the pilgrims were quiet and thoughtful as they left the plain and followed Greatheart along the sheltered pathways of his beautiful country. Feeble Mind clung closer than ever to the arm of his kind guide, for he was still timid at the sight of strange faces, and when the animals of the land saw the pilgrims, they came out to welcome them. Despondency had found a good friend in Valiant, and, much afraid, although she seldom left her father's side, generally had one of the older girls for her companion. Christiana and Mercy were never far apart, and the two little boys looked upon good-natured Old Honest as their special friend. So they took the last steps of their journey together and presently found themselves in one of the king's vineyards, where Greatheart desired them to rest. "We were so few when we started," said Mercy as she nestled down upon the soft grass with her hand clasped in Christiana's. "And now we are quite a large company. Some young and some old, some weak and some strong, and yet the king has cared for us all." Chapter 90. In the Land of Delight. The pilgrims were very happy in the Land of Delight. The king's servants provided homes for them all and told them what work they must do. Despondency and Feeble Mind had only to rest quietly until the king sent for them, but the younger ones each had their own duties to perform. Christiana spent most of her time teaching James and Joseph, and she often went with others of the king's servants to welcome the new pilgrims who came into the country nearly every day. Sometimes she stole quietly away with Mercy to walk down the side of the dark river. The sight of the troubled waters made Mercy tremble, but Christiana always looked beyond them at the beautiful golden light. And at last, Mercy began to lose her fear, and she tried to feel as Christiana did, that the coming of the king's messenger would be the beginning of a greater happiness than any she had yet known. "If only the water were less dark and rough," she used to say, "or if I could have you to cross with me, but if I go alone, it would be dreadful." "You should not think of the water at all," Christiana always answered. "You should think of the glorious city and the king who lives there, and our dear good prince, and of the shining ones who will receive you. Oh, Mercy, you need not be afraid." But although her fear grew less, Mercy never liked to watch the river. She loved best to wander in the king's gardens and talk to the children who spent so many hours among the vines and flowers. One duty the king desired even the tiniest children to perform was the gathering of flowers every day for the other older pilgrims, especially for those who were very old and weak and not able to walk in the garden and enjoy the beauty and perfume of the growing blossoms. After a time, when Innocence came to live once more with her sister, Mercy's chief pleasure was to help the little rabbit in choosing her flowers and carrying them to her friends. Old Mr. Honest often met them in the gardens in the early morning, and he used to say, "We old pilgrims are happy, for the little pilgrims strew our way with flowers." In one of the houses, a book was kept in which the king's servants had written the names of many pilgrims who had crossed the river and the stories of their lives. Matthew and Standfast studied this book carefully and hoped that the king would someday allow them to fight for him as bravely as the soldiers of whom they had read. The lame boy, Ready to Halt, loved the book too, but his favourite stories were of those pilgrims who had been feeble and weak like himself. "There are so many," he said one day. "I think it is comforting to read about them." And even despondency seemed more cheerful when Ready to Halt came to see him and told him of the king's love for the pilgrims and how the Shining Ones had made them their special care. Chapter 91. Christiana crosses the river. When Greatheart had brought Christiana and her companions safely to their journey's end, he returned to his master's house. But he had promised that he would someday visit them again, for most of his time was spent in guiding pilgrims along the way of the king. At last the day came for Little Innocence to leave the Valley of Peace, so her kind nannies sent for Greatheart and desired him to take the child safely to her sister. Innocence had learned to love her nannies, but she had not forgotten either Christiana or the young guide. She went with Greatheart quite contentedly, and it would be difficult to say which of the two received the warmer welcome when they reached Christiana's new home. Greatheart himself was very pleased to see the children again, and he told them that his master had given him permission to stay with them in the Land of Delight for a few weeks, so that he might rest in the king's garden and prepare himself for future work. When these weeks of rest were over, it pleased the king to give him some more work to do in the Land of Delight, and before this was finished, Christiana and several of the older pilgrims crossed the dark river and entered the celestial city. Christiana and Mercy had often watched the king's messengers as they passed through the streets, and wondered at whose house they would knock. When at last a Shining One was seen standing at their own door, the two girls trembled with fear and joy. But the message was not for Mercy. The Shining One spoke to Christiana. "Our king calls for you," he said. "He wishes you to come to his palace." Christiana felt glad to think of being with the king in his glorious city, but she was sorry to leave her brothers and Little Innocence and all her kind friends. However, she knew that it would not be very long before they followed her, and when she remembered this, it comforted her. She thought she would like to bid Greatheart goodbye, so she sent for him and told him what the Shining One had said. He stayed with her a little while, talking about the river and the way of crossing it. When the other pilgrims heard that Christiana was going away, they came to see her also. She asked Valiant to be a friend to her brothers, and he promised that he would watch over them as long as he remained in that country. Then she bade them all goodbye, but they would not let her go away alone. They came with her to the water's edge and watched her until she was out of sight. They could see the Shining Ones waiting on the other side, and they knew when Christiana had safely reached the shore, for the bright company moved slowly away from the river, up the steep pathway to the golden gates, and disappeared at last in the glory of the celestial city. Poor Little Innocence cried when her sister left her, and so did James and Joseph. But Matthew and Mercy took them home and comforted them. Greatheart and Valiant could not be sad, although they both loved Christiana dearly. They knew that she had entered the celestial city and that she would never be weary or anxious anymore. So, instead of weeping, they praised the king who had taken his faithful pilgrim to dwell with him forever. Chapter 92. The King Calls for His Servants. It was not long after the departure of Christiana that a message was brought to the lame rabbit Ready to Halt. Valiant and Greatheart were both with him when the Shining One came, and when he received the king's summons, he turned to Valiant, saying, You must keep my crutches until you find another pilgrim who needs them. Then give them to him with my good wishes, and tell him that I hope he will be able to serve the king better than I have done." Then he looked at Greatheart and said, "You have been very kind to me, and you have helped me wonderfully in my pilgrimage." His two friends went with him to the brink of the river, and when he had stepped into the water, he laid his crutches down upon the bank. "I shall never need them again," he said. "I know that in the king's city there are horses and chariots that shine like the sun." A few days later, Feeble Mind was sent for. The king's message to him was very kind and gentle, and the poor weak pilgrim rejoiced to think that he would soon be in the land where toil and trouble are unknown. Some weeks passed before the Shining Ones came again, and their next message was for Despondency. When Much Afraid heard it, she begged to go with him, and the king, who knew how dearly she loved her father and how faithful she had been to him throughout all the danger and difficulties of their pilgrimage, granted her request. So the father and daughter entered the dark river hand in hand, and the pilgrims upon the shore could hear Much Afraid singing a song of praise as she went through the water, although she was too far away from them to distinguish its words. Old Mr. Honest received the next summons, and just at that time the river was so full of water that it overflowed its banks. But although it seemed terribly wide and deep, the good old cat was not afraid. He knew that his king would not allow him to perish in the dark waters. He went cheerfully down to the shore at the appointed time, and there he found a friend waiting for him, a friend whom he had known nearly all his life, whose name was Good Conscience. He had once said to him, "I shall hope to have your help when I cross the dark river." And Good Conscience had remembered this and had obtained the king's leave to help his friend in this last hour of trouble. So he gave him his hand, and although the waters raged wildly around them, Honest leaned upon his strong shoulders and crossed the river in safety. Chapter 93. The Departure of Standfast and Valiant. I can only tell you of the departure of two more pilgrims. Standfast had hoped that he might be allowed to spend a long life in working for the king, but this was not his master's will. Soon the king summoned his faithful young servant to cross the river to the celestial city. At first, Standfast could scarcely believe that the king really wished to receive him into his own palace, but the Shining Ones assured him that it was true. "You have served my master faithfully," said he, "and he is not willing that you should be living at a distance from him any longer." So Standfast prepared for his last journey and gave Greatheart many messages, for he hoped that the guide would perhaps someday meet with others of his family who might be following in his footsteps. The floods had gone down before this time, and the waters were still and calm. When Steadfast reached the middle of the river, he turned and spoke once more to his friends. "This river makes so many creatures afraid," he said. "Indeed, I was frightened myself before I entered it. But my fear is gone. I can feel the firm ground under my feet, and soon I shall be with my good prince. It has been pleasant to hear of him and think of him, but now I shall see him with my own eyes. He has helped me and strengthened me all through my pilgrimage, and he is with me now." Then the other pilgrims saw that, as he turned again toward the city, a beautiful light fell upon his face, and in the clear air they could see quite across the river and were able to watch the multitude of Shining Ones who came down to receive the faithful lad and lead him into the presence of the king. Valiant was also summoned across the river. He had no fear of crossing, for he had always been brave, and his heart was full of trust in the good king. He was longing to see his wife and his dear little son once more, and he knew how happy Christian and his mother would be when they heard who was waiting to receive their welcome. "Mine has been a hard pilgrimage," he said, "and I have had to fight my way through many troubles and dangers. But I am going now to my true home in the celestial city, where I shall be safe and happy forever." The good soldier had no longer any use for his sword, so he left the bright weapon in Greatheart's care and desired him to give it to some other pilgrim. Then he entered the river, and his friends soon lost sight of him. But presently the sound of silver trumpets was heard on the other shore, and they knew that valiant Christian's father was on his way to the gates of the city. End of the Little Pilgrim's Progress.